Chapter 1. The Overheard Conversation. Blaise Zabini had always prided himself on his ability to remain unseen when it mattered. Tonight, crouched in the shadows behind a suit of armor on the 3rd floor, he wished that particular skill had failed him. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, save for the 2 figures speaking in hushed tones near the window overlooking the Quidditch pitch. Professor McGonagall's tartan robes caught the moonlight as she gestured toward the grounds below, where the remnants of the day's match, the abandoned Quidditch equipment, the scattered programs, lay like discarded memories. "The boy nearly died today, Albus." McGonagall's voice carried a tremor that Blaise had never heard before. "Those Dementors, they targeted him specifically. You saw what happened." Dumbledore's response was measured, and almost gentle. Harry's sensitivity to the Dementors is unfortunate, but not unexpected given his history. We knew this year would test him. Test him? The sharpness in McGonagall's tone made Blaise press closer to the cold stone wall. "Albus, the boy collapsed 50 feet in the air. If his broom hadn't slowed his fall. But it did slow his fall, Minerva, as I knew it would." The silence that followed those words felt heavier than the October air, seeping through the ancient stones. Blaise found himself holding his breath, though he couldn't say why. "You knew," McGonagall repeated slowly. "You knew the Dementors would affect him this severely, and you allowed the match to proceed. The boy must learn to face his demons, Minerva. Coddling him serves no one, least of all the cause that requires his eventual sacrifice." Blaise's blood turned to ice. Sacrifice. The word hung in the air like a curse, and suddenly his mother's warnings from just 3 months ago came rushing back with crystalline clarity. "The Zabini family has survived 7 centuries by understanding one simple truth, my darling," his mother had said, her elegant fingers tracing the rim of her teacup as they sat in their Italian villa. "Power corrupts, but righteousness corrupts absolutely. The most dangerous man in any room is the one who believes his cause justifies any means." She had been speaking of Dumbledore then, though Blaise hadn't understood why. His mother rarely spoke of her Hogwarts days, but that afternoon she had been unusually forthcoming about the headmaster's methods. "I've watched that man orchestrate tragedies for 40 years, she had continued, her voice taking on the cold precision she used when discussing business. "The Prewett twins, sent on a mission he knew would kill them. The McKinnons, their safe house location, somehow leaked to Death Eaters just hours after Dumbledore visited. The Potters themselves, convinced to rely on a secret keeper he personally suggested." At the time, Blaise had assumed his mother's cynicism stemmed from her own dark experiences during the war. She had, after all, lost 2 husbands to accidents during those terrible years. But now, listening to Dumbledore speak of Harry Potter, a 13-year-old boy, as a necessary sacrifice, her words took on a horrifying new meaning. "Albus, he is a child," McGonagall was saying, though her protest sounded weary, not as if she had made it many times before. "He is a weapon, Minerva. One that must be properly tempered, if it is to serve its purpose. The boy's suffering is regrettable but necessary. It builds character, resilience, and, most importantly, the kind of loyalty that cannot be broken by comfort or kindness." Blaise had to clamp a hand over his mouth to keep from making a sound. The casual cruelty in Dumbledore's tone, the way he spoke of engineering a child's suffering, made his stomach churn. "And if the suffering breaks him instead?" McGonagall asked quietly. "Then he was never strong enough to serve his purpose to begin with, and we will find another way." The headmaster turned from the window then, his long silver beard catching the moonlight. Even from his hiding place, Blaise could see the cold calculation in those famous blue eyes, eyes the entire wizarding world trusted implicitly. "I trust you will continue to keep young Harry properly isolated, Minerva. His growing friendships with Miss Granger and Mr. Weasley are acceptable, useful even. But we cannot allow him to form attachments to anyone with the knowledge or influence to question our guidance." "You mean anyone who might actually help him," McGonagall said, and for a moment her voice carried a note of something that might have been defiance. "I mean anyone who might interfere with what must be done," Dumbledore replied mildly. "The boy's trust in authority figures is essential, Minerva. If he begins to question my judgment, if he starts thinking for himself too much, too early, well, let us simply say that would complicate matters considerably." They moved past Blaise's hiding spot then, their footsteps echoing down the corridor as they continued their conversation in voices too low to follow. But Blaise had heard enough. He remained crouched behind the armor for long minutes after they disappeared, his mind racing. Everything his mother had told him, every warning about Dumbledore's methods, every hint about the headmaster's willingness to sacrifice others for his version of the greater good. It was all true. And Harry Potter, the boy who lived, the savior of the wizarding world, was just another pawn on Dumbledore's chessboard. Blaise thought of the boy he had shared classes with for 3 years. Potter was ordinary, really. Brave to the point of stupidity, occasionally brilliant, as often infuriating in his Gryffindor righteousness. But beneath all of that was something Blaise recognized because he saw it in his own mirror every morning. The careful distance of someone who had learned not to trust too easily, the quiet wariness of a child who had known too much disappointment. The Dursleys. Blaise had never paid much attention to Potter's home life, but now he wondered. His mother had mentioned once, almost offhandedly, that placing a magical child with violently anti-magical relatives was a choice that served no purpose except to ensure that child would be desperate for any adult approval when they finally entered the wizarding world. How perfectly convenient for Dumbledore. The realization hit him like a physical blow. Potter's hero worship of the headmaster, his desperate need for approval from authority figures, his willingness to charge headfirst into danger on the word of adults who claimed to care about him. It wasn't natural Gryffindor recklessness. It was the calculated result of 13 years of careful manipulation. And now Dumbledore was escalating. The Dementors, the deliberate isolation, the casual dismissal of the boy's suffering. It was all part of some larger plan that required Potter to be broken down, built back up, and ultimately sacrificed for whatever cause Dumbledore deemed worthy. Blaise stood slowly, his legs cramped from crouching. His mother had taught him many things over the years, but the most important lesson was this. When you witnessed an injustice and had the power to act, your silence made you complicit. He could return to Slytherin Tower, mind his own business, and let events unfold as Dumbledore intended. It would be the smart thing to do, the safe thing. The Zabini family had survived 7 centuries by avoiding entanglements that didn't serve their interests, but Potter didn't deserve what was being done to him. And if Dumbledore was truly as dangerous as his mother believed, then everyone in the wizarding world was at risk from the headmaster's version of the greater good. Someone needed to warn Potter. Someone needed to help him see the truth about the man he trusted most. The question was who? Potter's closest friends, Granger and Weasley, were unlikely to believe such accusations without proof. And even if they did, they were just 13-year-old students. What could they do against someone of Dumbledore's influence? But then Blaise remembered something else his mother had said. The most dangerous person to a manipulator is someone who can think clearly, research thoroughly, and isn't emotionally invested in maintaining comfortable illusions. Granger. The girl was brilliant, obsessively thorough in her research, and, most importantly, she cared enough about Potter to listen. Really listen, to concerns about his welfare. If anyone could be convinced to see the truth, if anyone could help Potter break free from Dumbledore's web of manipulation, it would be Hermione Granger. The decision crystallized in his mind with surprising clarity. Tomorrow he would find a way to approach her. It wouldn't be easy. Slytherins and Gryffindors mixing was suspicious enough without adding the complication of his family's reputation. But he would find a way. Potter deserved to know the truth about the man who claimed to protect him. And if Blaise was very careful, very clever, perhaps he could help ensure that this time Dumbledore's sacrificial lamb would choose to walk away from the altar. The thought should have terrified him. Instead, as he finally made his way back to the Slytherin dormitories, Blaise Zabini found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. After all, the most interesting games were always the most dangerous ones. Chapter 2. An Unlikely Proposal. The library was Hermione's sanctuary, especially in the hours between dinner and curfew, when most students abandoned their studies for gossip and games. Tonight, 3 days after Harry's terrifying fall during the Quidditch match, she had claimed her usual spot in the furthest corner, surrounded by towers of books on defensive magic and the nature of Dementors. She had been researching obsessively since Harry had collapsed 50 feet above the pitch, his screams echoing across the grounds as those horrible creatures descended. The image haunted her, Harry falling like a broken bird while she sat helpless in the stands. She needed to understand what had happened, needed to find a way to help him. The soft scrape of a chair being pulled out made her look up from Magical Creatures, a guide to the dark and dangerous. Blaise Zabini stood beside her table, his usually pristine appearance slightly disheveled, as if he had been running his hands through his hair. "Miss Granger," he said quietly, glancing around the nearly empty library. "May I sit?" Hermione blinked, certain she had misheard. In 3 years at Hogwarts, Blaise Zabini had never spoken directly to her. She knew him, of course. Everyone knew the elegant Slytherin boy with his expensive robes and carefully neutral expressions. But he existed in a different world from hers, one of pure-blood politics and Slytherin loyalties. She began, then caught herself staring. "Yes, of course." He settled into the chair across from her with fluid grace, his dark eyes scanning the books spread across her table. "Researching Dementors, I see." It wasn't really a question, but Hermione nodded anyway. "I'm trying to understand what happened to Harry during the match. Why they affected him so strongly." Something flickered across Blaise's features, an expression too quick to interpret. "And what have you discovered?" "That Dementors feed on happiness and hope," she said slowly, still unsure why he was asking. "They force people to relive their worst memories. But Harry's reaction was extreme, much worse than what the other students experienced." "Perhaps," Blaise said carefully, "Potter's worst memories are more terrible than most." The way he said it made Hermione look up sharply. There was something in his tone. Not the casual cruelty she might expect from a Slytherin discussing Harry's pain, but something that sounded almost like sympathy. "Why are you here, Zabini?" she asked directly. Hermione had never been one for subtle social maneuvering. Blaise was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the open book between them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I overheard something 2 nights ago that I think you need to know." The word sent a chill down Hermione's spine. Something in his tone, deadly serious, almost haunted, made her close the book and give him her full attention. "What kind of something?" "A conversation between Professor Dumbledore and Professor McGonagall. About Potter. About—" He paused, seeming to weigh his words. "About his usefulness as a sacrifice." Hermione felt the blood drain from her face. "That's impossible. Professor Dumbledore would never—" "Wouldn't he?" Blaise interrupted gently. "Think, Granger. Really think about Potter's life at this school. How many times has he been placed in mortal danger? How many times has Dumbledore's guidance led him directly into situations that should have killed him?" "Harry chose to go after the Philosopher's Stone," Hermione said quickly. But even as she spoke, she could hear the weakness in her own argument. "He chose to go into the Chamber of Secrets." "Did he?" Blaise leaned forward slightly. "Or was he guided toward those choices by someone who knew exactly how to manipulate a brave, desperate boy who had been starved of adult approval his entire life. The words hit like physical blows. Hermione opened her mouth to protest, but no sound came out. Because, suddenly, viewed through this new lens, Harry's heroics took on a different cast entirely. "I don't understand," she whispered. "My mother taught me to recognize manipulation," Blaise said quietly. "She's had extensive experience with men who claim to have others' best interests at heart while serving only their own agenda. And she warned me specifically about Dumbledore. Your mother went to school with him, watched him operate for 7 years. She's been watching him operate for 40 years since." Blaise's voice carried a bitter edge. "She told me once that the most dangerous man in any room is the one who believes his cause justifies any means." Hermione stared at him, her brilliant mind racing through memories, conversations, inconsistencies she had never allowed herself to examine too closely. Harry's inexplicable placement with relatives who despised magic, Dumbledore's tendency to disappear during crises, only to arrive just in time to offer cryptic guidance, the way Harry always seemed to face his challenges alone, but despite having friends and allies who could help. "What exactly did you hear?" she asked, her voice smaller than she intended. Blaise glanced around the library again before answering. Dumbledore told McGonagall that Potter's suffering was necessary to build character and loyalty, that he was a weapon that needed to be properly tempered. And when McGonagall asked what would happen if the suffering broke him instead, Blaise met her eyes. Dumbledore said they would find another way. The world seemed to tilt around Hermione. She gripped the edge of the table, trying to steady herself against the implications of what Blaise was telling her. "But why are you telling me this?" she managed. We don't even know each other." "Because Potter trusts you," Blaise said simply. "More than anyone else in this school, or he trusts you to tell him the truth. And because you're brilliant enough to see the patterns once you start looking, and brave enough to act on what you find." Hermione felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. Harry did trust her, trusted her with his fears about his parents' death, his worries about fitting into the wizarding world, his desperate need to prove himself worthy of the love he'd never received. If what Blaise was saying was true, then that trust had been systematically cultivated and exploited by the one adult Harry believed cared about him most. I need proof," she said finally. "I can't destroy Harry's faith in Dumbledore based on overheard conversation and your mother's suspicions." "I know," Blaise said. "I wouldn't expect you to. But I think if we start paying attention, really paying attention, to Dumbledore's behavior, his decisions, his patterns, we'll find the proof you need." "We?" "I meant what I said, Granger. Potter doesn't deserve what's being done to him. And if Dumbledore is willing to sacrifice him for some greater good, then none of us are safe from his version of righteousness." Hermione studied his face, looking for signs of deception or hidden agenda, but all she saw was a kind of grim determination she recognized because she felt it burning in her own chest. "What are you proposing?" "That we watch, that we document, that we gather evidence of Dumbledore's manipulation, so that when we approach Potter, we can show him the truth rather than just telling him." Blaise paused. "And that we figure out how to help him break free before it's too late." The magnitude of what he was suggesting made Hermione's head spin. They were talking about opposing Albus Dumbledore, the most powerful wizard in Britain, the man who had defeated Grindelwald, the leader of the light. It was tantamount to treason against everything she had been taught to believe about good and evil in the wizarding world. But Harry had nightmares about his parents' death. Harry flinched when adults raised their voices. Harry threw himself into danger with the desperate courage of someone who believed his worth was measured only by his willingness to suffer for others. If Dumbledore had orchestrated that. "How?" she asked quietly. Relief flickered across Blaise's features. "We start by researching Dumbledore's history with other students. Look for patterns in how he's guided people in the past, What happened to those who trusted his judgment completely? And we observe his behavior toward Harry going forward, Hermione added, her research instincts taking over. Document his responses to Harry's struggles, his decisions about Harry's care and safety. Exactly. Blaise reached into his robes and pulled out a small piece of parchment. We'll need a way to communicate without being observed. I've taken the liberty of researching some discreet methods. Hermione unfolded the parchment and found herself looking at detailed notes about magical communication techniques, charmed coins that warmed when touched by their partner, invisible ink that appeared only when exposed to specific wand movements, as even a simplified version of the Protean charm that could sync messages across multiple objects. You've already been planning this, she realized. I've been planning since the moment I heard Dumbledore speak about Potter as an acceptable loss, Blaise said grimly. The question was whether I could find someone willing to help. And if I had said no? Then I would have tried to help Potter alone, and probably failed spectacularly. His smile was rueful. I may be Slytherin, Granger, but I'm not fool enough to think I can take on Dumbledore without allies. Hermione looked down at the parchment again, at the careful notes and detailed planning. Blaise had spent days preparing for this conversation, researching ways they could work together safely. He was serious about this, about helping Harry, about opposing Dumbledore if necessary. The charmed coins, she said finally. They're the most reliable and hardest to trace. Agreed. I can acquire them. No, I'll make them. I've been studying advanced charms work. She looked up to meet his eyes. If we're doing this, we do it right. Full discretion, careful documentation, and no unnecessary risks. And if what we find proves that Dumbledore truly is manipulating Potter, Hermione thought of Harry's haunted expression after the Dementor attack, the way he had apologized for fainting, as if his trauma was an inconvenience to others. She thought of his determination to save everyone while never expecting to be saved himself. Then we help him see the truth, she said firmly, and we help him choose his own path, whatever that might be. Blaise nodded solemnly. Then we have an agreement. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their decision settling between them. Hermione realized that everything had changed in the space of a single conversation. She was no longer just Harry Potter's brilliant best friend. She was now part of something that felt suspiciously like a conspiracy against one of the most powerful men in the wizarding world. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, as she began gathering her books, she found herself thinking clearly for the first time since the Quidditch match. Harry deserved to know the truth about his life. And if the adults in charge wouldn't protect him, then perhaps it was time for his friends to step up instead. Even if one of those friends happened to be a Slytherin with a talent for seeing through lies. Or Chapter 3, Gathering Evidence. The charmed galleon felt warm against Hermione's palm as she pressed it gently, sending the agreed-upon signal to Blaise. 3 pulses meant she had found something significant in her research. Within minutes, she heard his soft footsteps approaching the secluded corner of the restricted section where they had arranged to meet. It had been 2 weeks since their initial conversation, 2 weeks of careful investigation and growing horror at what they were uncovering. Hermione had thrown herself into the research with the same obsessive thoroughness she applied to all her studies, but this time the stakes felt infinitely higher than any exam. "What have you found?" Blaise whispered, settling into the chair across from her. The restricted section was officially off-limits after hours, but Hermione's reputation with the librarians and Blaise's talent for avoiding detection had served them well. Hermione opened the leather-bound volume before her, Hogwarts, a recent history, and pointed to a passage she had marked with a slip of parchment. James Clearwater, Ravenclaw, graduated 1979. Brilliant student, extraordinary potential in transfiguration. Dumbledore personally recommended him for a dangerous mission with the Order of the Phoenix immediately after graduation. And, Blaise prompted, though his expression suggested he already suspected where this was leading. Dead within 6 months, killed during a raid that intelligence later revealed was compromised from the beginning. Hermione's voice was barely audible. The mission was designed to fail, Blaise. It was a deliberate sacrifice to protect more valuable assets. She flipped to another marked page. Alice McKinnon. Yes. Neville's mother. But she had a cousin. 17 years old, still in her 7th year. Dumbledore convinced her to gather intelligence from Death Eater families during Hogsmeade visits. She was found dead in the Shrieking Shack 3 days before graduation. Blaise's jaw tightened. My mother mentioned the McKinnons. She said Dumbledore had a talent for convincing young people that dying for the cause was the highest form of honor. There are more. Hermione turned pages with hands that trembled slightly. So many more. All brilliant students, all personally guided by Dumbledore, all dead before their 20th birthdays. She looked up to meet his eyes. He's been doing this for decades, Blaise, or using students as expendable resources. And now it's Potter's turn, Blaise said grimly. Hermione nodded, then pulled out another book, this one a collection of Daily Prophet archives she had specially requested. But that's not the worst part. Look at this. She opened to an article dated December 1981, just months after Harry's parents' death. Dumbledore refuses ministry protection for boy who lived. The accompanying article detailed how Cornelius Fudge had offered to place Harry in protective ministry custody with round-the-clock aura protection and the finest magical tutors. Dumbledore had declined on Harry's behalf, insisting the boy needed a normal upbringing away from the magical world. He could have protected Harry properly, Hermione whispered. He could have ensured Harry grew up loved, educated, was prepared for his role in our world. Instead, he deliberately chose to place him with relatives who would ensure Harry arrived at Hogwarts, desperate for any adult approval. Making him the perfect candidate for manipulation, Blaise finished. He was quiet for a moment, then reached into his robes. My turn. My mother's latest letter arrived this morning. He unfolded an elegant piece of parchment covered in flowing script. She's been discreetly questioning some of her contacts about Dumbledore's wartime decisions. Listen to this. The Prewett twins were sent to their deaths with deliberately inadequate backup because Dumbledore needed their sacrifice to convince certain ministry officials that the threat was serious enough to justify extreme measures. Hermione felt sick. Fabian and Gideon Prewett, they're Molly Weasley's brothers. The same. And here, the Potter family's secret keeper arrangement was Dumbledore's suggestion. He personally recommended Pettigrew, despite concerns raised by other Order members about the boy's suitability. Blaise's voice carried a cold fury. He orchestrated their deaths, Hermione. Harry's parents died because Dumbledore needed a martyred hero and a traumatized weapon. The words hung in the air between them like a curse. Hermione stared down at the evidence spread across the table. Decades of manipulation, sacrifice, and calculated loss of life, all orchestrated by the man the wizarding world revered as their greatest protector. And now Harry faces the Dementors, she said quietly. The most traumatic creatures in existence, art placed at his school without adequate protection or preparation. While Dumbledore forbids him from learning proper defensive magic, Blaise added, Potter could have been learning the Patronus charm in first year if Dumbledore had wanted him to. Instead, he's allowed to suffer through panic attacks and relive his worst memories until he's desperate enough to accept any help offered. Hermione thought of Harry's haunted expression after each Dementor encounter, the way he flinched when anyone mentioned his parents' death. He's being systematically broken down so he'll be easier to control. The same pattern as all the others, Blaise confirmed. Isolation from healthy support systems, orchestrated dangers that build dependence on authority. And constant reminders of duty and sacrifice until the victim believes their worth is measured only by their willingness to die for others. Hermione closed the books with hands that shook with rage. We have to tell Harry. Not yet. Blaise's voice was gentle but firm. Think about it from his perspective. Potter's entire identity is built around his trust in Dumbledore. If we approach him with accusations he's not ready to hear, he'll reject everything and probably report us to the headmaster himself. Then what do you suggest? We continue gathering evidence, but we also start planting seeds of doubt. Small questions that make Potter think without triggering his defensive instincts. Blaise leaned forward intently. For instance, why wasn't he taught about the magical world before Hogwarts? Why does he face every crisis alone when he has friends willing to help? Why does Dumbledore disappear whenever Potter needs guidance most? Hermione considered this approach. It had the virtue of respecting Harry's intelligence while protecting their investigation. And we document everything going forward, every interaction between Harry and Dumbledore, every decision that puts Harry at risk, every opportunity for help that Dumbledore mysteriously fails to provide. Exactly. By the time we're ready to show Potter the full truth, we'll have enough evidence to prove the pattern beyond any doubt. Hermione began gathering their research materials, her mind already racing ahead to their next steps. I'll need access to more historical records. There might be information in the Hogwarts archives that isn't available in the library. And I'll continue working my mother's network. She has contacts throughout Europe who remember Dumbledore's methods from the Grindelwald War. Blaise paused. There are rumors that his tactics haven't changed much in 50 years. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, the weight of their discoveries settling between them. What had started as concern for one friend had revealed a conspiracy spanning decades, with implications that reached far beyond Harry Potter. Blaise, Hermione said finally, what if we're wrong? What if there are reasons we don't understand for the choices Dumbledore has made? Then we'll discover those reasons through our research and adjust accordingly, he replied calmly. But tell me honestly, or Hermione, after everything we've uncovered tonight, do you still believe we're wrong? Hermione thought of Harry's nightmares, his desperate need for approval, his certainty that he was only valuable if he was useful to others. She thought of James Clearwater and Alice McKinnon and the Prewett twins, all brilliant young people who had trusted Dumbledore's guidance unto death. No, she whispered. I don't think we're wrong at all. Then we continue. Blaise stood and began helping her pack the books away. But carefully. Dumbledore has had decades to perfect his methods, and he won't hesitate to remove obstacles to his plans. Are you saying he would hurt us? I'm saying he would do whatever serves his greater good, and our friendship with Potter makes us either valuable allies or dangerous enemies. Blaise's expression was grim. Yet we need to be very sure which category we fall into before he makes that determination himself. As they prepared to leave the restricted section, Hermione felt the full magnitude of what they were undertaking settle on her shoulders. They weren't just trying to help a friend anymore. They were actively opposing one of the most powerful wizards in history, a man who had spent decades manipulating events on a scale they were only beginning to comprehend. But Harry had trusted her with his fears about not being good enough, about disappointing the people who had saved him, about being nothing more than the scar on his forehead. If Dumbledore was responsible for instilling those fears, we'll need to be smarter than he is, she said finally. Blaise's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Then it's fortunate we have a Ravenclaw's research skills and a Slytherin's understanding of long-term strategy. And a Gryffindor's willingness to act when action is needed, Hermione added. Indeed. Between the three of us, we might just be able to give Potter something he's never had before. What's that? A real choice about his own life. As they made their way back through the darkened corridors of Hogwarts, Hermione found herself thinking about choices, all the choices that had been taken away from Harry before he was old enough to make them himself, and all the choices he could still make if given the chance. Their investigation was far from complete, but already one thing was becoming clear. Harry Potter deserved to know the truth about his life, no matter how painful that truth might be. And if Dumbledore wouldn't give him that choice, then perhaps it was time for his friends to do so instead. The charmed galleon in her pocket had grown cool, but the determination burning in her chest showed no signs of fading. Tomorrow, they would continue gathering evidence. Tonight, she would begin planning how to give Harry Potter back his freedom. Chapter 4. The Patronus Revelation. Harry slumped into the armchair by the Gryffindor common room fire, exhaustion weighing on him like a physical burden. His third lesson with Professor Lupin had ended the same way as the first two, with him unconscious on the floor of the defense classroom, while phantom screams echoed in his ears. The common room was nearly empty at this late hour, most students having retired to their dormitories. But only Hermione remained at the table where she had been working on her ancient runes translation, though Harry noticed she kept glancing up at him with poorly concealed concern. "How did it go?" she asked gently, closing her textbook and moving to the chair across from him. Harry rubbed his face with both hands, trying to banish the lingering echoes of his mother's voice. That last, desperate scream that seemed to grow clearer with each failed attempt at producing a Patronus. "Same as always," he muttered. "The Dementor gets close, I hear. Things. And then I wake up on the floor feeling like I've been hit by a bludger." "What kind of things?" Hermione's voice was carefully neutral, but something in her tone made Harry look up. She was watching him with an intensity that suggested this wasn't casual curiosity. "At my mum," he said quietly. "I hear her screaming, begging Voldemort to take her instead of me." He paused, the memory of that voice, so young, so desperate, making his chest tighten. "And sometimes I hear him too. Voldemort." Laughing. Hermione's face went pale. "Harry, how often do you remember that night?" "I don't remember it exactly. It's more like pieces, fragments that don't quite fit together." Harry stared into the fire, trying to organize thoughts that felt scattered and fragmented. "Green light, my mother's voice, the sound of someone falling. But it's all confused, like trying to remember a nightmare." "And the Patronus lessons are making it clearer?" "Professor Lupin says that's normal, that Dementors force you to relive your worst memories, so the more I'm exposed to them, or the more I'll remember." Harry's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "He says I need to accept the memories before I can move past them." Hermione was quiet for a long moment, her brilliant mind clearly working through something. When she spoke again, her voice carried a strange tension. "Harry, how much do you actually remember about living with the Dursleys before Hogwarts?" The change of subject caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean, do you remember being happy there? Do you remember them treating you well when you were younger?" Harry almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "Happy? Hermione, they locked me in a cupboard. They told me my parents died in a car crash, and that magic didn't exist. They made me cook and clean while Dudley got everything he wanted." He shook his head. "Well, I can't remember a single day when they treated me well." "Not even when you were very small?" Most children have some happy memories from early childhood, even in difficult situations. Harry considered this, really tried to think back to his earliest memories of Privet Drive. What he found was a collection of fragments, but none of them were pleasant. Hunger, the cramped darkness of his cupboard, Aunt Petunia's shrill voice berating him for things he didn't understand, Uncle Vernon's heavy footsteps and shouted threats. "No," he said finally. "Nothing happy. It was always like that." Hermione leaned forward slightly. "Harry, what if I told you that there were other options, or to other places you could have been raised after your parents died?" "What do you mean?" "I mean that magical children who lose their parents aren't automatically placed with Muggle relatives. There are wizarding foster families, magical guardians appointed by the Ministry. Even Hogwarts itself has provisions for housing orphaned students." Hermione's voice was carefully measured, as if she was walking across thin ice. "Placing you with the Dursleys wasn't inevitable. It was a choice. The words hit Harry like a physical blow. A choice. All those years of loneliness, of hunger, of being told he was worthless and unwanted. It had been a choice. Whose choice? He asked quietly, though some part of him already knew the answer. Professor Dumbledore was your magical guardian after your parents died, or he made the decision to place you with your aunt and uncle. Harry stared at her, feeling something fundamental shift in his understanding of his own life. But the protection. My mother's sacrifice. Dumbledore said I was safe there because of the blood connection. That's what he told you, yes. Hermione's voice was gentle but relentless. But Harry, there are other forms of magical protection. Wards that could have been placed on any home. Protective enchantments that don't require blood relatives. The Fidelius charm that kept your parents hidden. That could have been used again. Then why? Before Hermione could answer, a soft voice spoke from the shadows near the portrait hole. Because isolation breeds dependence. Harry spun around to see Blaise Zabini emerging from the darkness, his expression grim. Harry reached for his wand instinctively, but Hermione raised a hand. It's all right, Harry. Blaise he's been helping me research some things. Research what things? Harry's voice carried a dangerous edge. And what are you doing here, Zabini? This is the Gryffindor common room. Your friend gave me the password, Blaise said calmly, settling into a nearby chair without invitation. And we've been researching Dumbledore's methods of guidance with his students, past and present. Harry felt anger flare in his chest. You've been talking to Slytherins about Dumbledore, about me. We've been trying to understand why you've been placed in danger so consistently, Hermione said quickly. Harry, think about it. In your first year, you faced Voldemort over the Philosopher's Stone. In your second year, you went into the Chamber of Secrets alone to face a basilisk. This year, you're being tormented by Dementors. And in every case, you've received guidance that led you directly into mortal peril. I chose to do those things, Harry protested. No one forced me. Didn't they? Blaise's voice was quiet but cutting. Potter, tell me, when you decided to go after the stone, had anyone suggested that the protections around it might not be sufficient? When you chose to enter the chamber, had anyone offered to go with you, or suggested waiting for adult help? When the Dementors attack you, has anyone offered to teach you proper shielding charms, or suggested removing you from their presence? Harry opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Because now that Blaise mentioned it, the pattern was disturbing. Yet adults who should have protected him had instead offered minimal guidance and stepped back to let him face dangers alone. The Dursleys were chosen specifically because they would ensure you arrived at Hogwarts desperate for adult approval, Blaise continued relentlessly. A child who had been loved and supported would question why he was being sent into danger. A child who had been starved of affection would do anything to prove himself worthy of it. That's not... Dumbledore wouldn't... Wouldn't he? Hermione pulled out a piece of parchment covered in her neat handwriting. I've been researching historical cases, Harry. Students who trusted Dumbledore's guidance completely. James Clearwater, graduated 1979, sent on a mission that was designed to fail. Alice McKinnon's cousin, killed gathering intelligence Dumbledore knew was compromised. The Prewett twins, Molly's brothers, sent to their deaths with inadequate backup because their sacrifice would convince the Ministry to take stronger action. Harry stared at the parchment, the names and dates blurring before his eyes. You're saying that he deliberately... I'm saying he has a history of using people he considers expendable to achieve his goals, Hermione said softly. And Harry, I'm terrified that he considers you expendable too. The silence that followed was deafening. Harry could hear the fire crackling, could hear the wind rattling the windows, could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. But underneath it all was a terrible growing certainty that what they were telling him made horrible sense. The Patronus lessons, he said slowly. Professor Lupin says I need to relive my worst memories to get past them. But what if the point isn't to help me get past them? What if the point is to make sure I never forget them? Hermione and Blaise exchanged a meaningful look. A person who can't forget their trauma is easier to control, Blaise said quietly. Someone who believes they deserve to suffer is more likely to accept suffering as necessary. Harry thought of his recurring nightmares, the way he flinched whenever adults raised their voices, the bone-deep certainty that he was only valuable if he was useful to others. He thought of the way Dumbledore's eyes always seemed to see right through him, as if measuring his worth against some invisible scale. But Professor Lupin is following Dumbledore's guidance, Hermione said gently. Harry, we're not saying Professor Lupin wants to hurt you. We're saying he might not realize what Dumbledore's true intentions are. Harry stood abruptly and began pacing in front of the fire. Everything they were telling him contradicted everything he had believed about his life, about the adults who claimed to care for him, about his own place in the wizarding world. If what you're saying is true, he said finally, if Dumbledore has been manipulating me all this time, then what am I supposed to do about it? You could start by asking questions, Blaise suggested. Real questions. Why were you placed with relatives who abused you when other options existed? Why do you face every crisis alone when you have friends willing to help? Why does Dumbledore disappear whenever you need guidance most? Or only to reappear with cryptic advice after you've already risked your life? And you could start thinking about what you actually want, Hermione added. Not what Dumbledore expects from you, not what the wizarding world needs from you, but what Harry Potter wants for his own life. The concept was so foreign to Harry that he actually stopped pacing. What did he want? For 13 years, his wants had been simple. Enough food, a warm place to sleep, someone to care whether he lived or died. At Hogwarts, his wants had expanded slightly. To fit in, to make his parents proud, to prove himself worthy of the love and respect he'd never received. But now they were asking him to consider wants that had nothing to do with proving his worth or earning approval. The idea was both terrifying and exhilarating. I don't know, he admitted. I don't know what I want. That's all right, Hermione said softly. It's all right not to know yet. But Harry, you deserve the chance to figure it out. You deserve to make your own choices about your own life. Harry looked at his two unlikely allies, his brilliant best friend and a Slytherin who had no obvious reason to care about his welfare. For the first time in his life, he was being offered something he had never imagined, the possibility of agency over his own destiny. If I start asking these questions, he said slowly, if I start pushing back against Dumbledore's expectations, what happens then? Blaise's smile was sharp as winter moonlight. Then you find out whether the people who claim to care about you actually respect your right to choose for yourself. And if they don't? Then you learn who your real allies are, Hermione said firmly, and you make decisions based on what you've learned. Harry sank back into his chair, his mind reeling from everything he'd heard. The fire had burned low while they talked, casting dancing shadows across their faces. Outside, he could hear the wind picking up, rattling the ancient windows of the castle. For the first time in his life, Harry Potter was beginning to understand that he might have choices he'd never known existed. The question now was whether he had the courage to make them. Chapter 5. The Sirius Black Connection. The December snow fell steadily outside the library windows as Hermione spread the latest batch of research across their secluded table. 3 weeks had passed since their conversation with Harry in the Gryffindor common room, and while he hadn't committed to their cause, he had begun asking the kinds of questions that suggested their words had taken root. Blaise arrived precisely on time, as had become his habit, carrying a leather portfolio that looked expensive enough to buy textbooks for half of Hogwarts. His usually composed expression carried an undercurrent of grim satisfaction that immediately caught Hermione's attention. "You found something," she said without preamble. "My mother's contacts came through," Blaise confirmed, settling into his chair and opening the portfolio. "It seems the Black family's legal troubles were more selective than the general public realizes." He withdrew a collection of official-looking documents, each bearing the seal of different wizarding legal institutions across Europe. "These are copies of court records, witness statements, and legal proceedings from Sirius Black's arrest and trial in November 1981. Hermione leaned forward eagerly. "What did you find?" "What I didn't find is more interesting." Blaise's voice carried that cold precision he used when discussing particularly damning evidence. "Hermione, there was no trial." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean, no trial?" "I mean, Sirius Black was arrested, questioned under highly irregular circumstances, and sent directly to Azkaban without a formal hearing, without legal representation, and without any of the standard investigative procedures being followed." Blaise pulled out a document marked with the Ministry's official seal. "This is the arrest warrant, signed by Bartemius Crouch Sr. Note the date, November 3rd, 1981, 2 days after the Potter's death." Hermione studied the parchment, her legal-minded brain immediately catching the irregularities. "There's no mention of evidence, no witness statements, no indication that any investigation was actually conducted." "Exactly. And here's the most damning part." Blaise produced another document. "This is a formal request for a trial hearing, submitted by Sirius Black himself from his cell in Azkaban. It's dated November 15th, 1981, 2 weeks after his arrest." "What happened to the request?" "It was denied, but by direct order of the chief warlock of the Wizengamot." Blaise's smile was sharp and bitter. "Care to guess who held that position in 1981? Hermione felt her blood turn to ice. "Dumbledore. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Chief Warlock and Supreme Mugwump, personally denied Sirius Black's request for a trial. The official reason given was overwhelming evidence of guilt and the need for immediate containment of the threat." "But what evidence?" Hermione demanded. "If there was no investigation, no trial, no proper procedures." "The evidence was Peter Pettigrew's apparent death and the testimony of witnesses who saw Black at the scene." Blaise pulled out a third document. "But here's what's truly interesting. Look at this list of potential witnesses who were never questioned." Hermione scanned the list, her heart sinking with each name. Remus Lupin, Alice Longbottom, Marlene McKinnon, Emmeline Vance. These are all Order of the Phoenix members. People who would have known about the Secret Keeper arrangement. People who could have testified that the Potters' original plan was to use Sirius as their secret keeper, but that the plan was changed at the last minute. Blaise's voice was deadly quiet. People who could have provided crucial context about the betrayal. And none of them were called to testify? None of them were even contacted. The investigation, such as it was, focused entirely on the explosion site where Pettigrew supposedly died. No one questioned the circumstances of the betrayal itself, the timing of the plan change, or whether Black could have had accomplices. Hermione felt sick. They wanted him in Azkaban. They wanted him silenced before he could reveal whatever he knew about how the Potters really died. It gets worse. Blaise produced a final document, this one bearing an official ministry letterhead. "This is a communication from Dumbledore to the Aura office, dated November 4th, 1 day after Black's arrest and 1 day before his transfer to Azkaban. He specifically requested that Black be held in solitary confinement and denied all visitors pending his eventual trial." A trial that never came. A trial that Dumbledore personally ensured would never come. Blaise gathered the documents back into his portfolio. Sirius Black has been in Azkaban for 12 years without ever having the chance to tell his side of the story, and the one man with the authority and influence to ensure he received proper justice was the same man who made sure he didn't. Hermione stared out the window at the falling snow, her mind racing through the implications. Harry's godfather, the person legally appointed to care for him if his parents died, the person who could have challenged Dumbledore's decision to place Harry with the Dursleys. The person who might have told Harry the truth about his parents' death, about the war, about the choices available to him. Blaise's expression was grim. Dumbledore needed Harry isolated, dependent, and ignorant. Sirius Black represented a threat to all three objectives. So he let an innocent man rot in prison for over a decade to maintain control over a child. The words tasted bitter in Hermione's mouth. God, Blaise, how deep does this conspiracy go? Deep enough that we're only seeing the surface. Blaise leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes reflecting the weight of their discoveries. But we have enough now to approach Potter. He deserves to know that his godfather might be innocent, and that Dumbledore is the reason Black never had a chance to prove it. Hermione nodded slowly, then froze as another realization struck her. Blaise, if Sirius is innocent, then he's not trying to kill Harry. He's probably trying to reach him, to make contact, which would explain why he's managed to evade capture for months, despite the entire ministry hunting for him. He's not trying to hide. He's trying to get close to Hogwarts, close to Potter. The implication sent chills down Hermione's spine. All those security measures, what all those dementors around the school, they're not protecting Harry from a killer. They're preventing an innocent man from reaching his godfather. And if Black does manage to make contact, if he tells Potter the truth about what happened 12 years ago, Blaise didn't need to finish the thought. Harry would learn that Dumbledore condemned an innocent man to 12 years of hell to keep Harry under his control. Hermione felt anger burning in her chest, hot and righteous. We have to tell him. Carefully, Blaise cautioned. Potter still thinks Black betrayed his parents. He's been conditioned to see him as the ultimate enemy. If we approach this wrong, he'll reject everything we tell him and probably report us to Dumbledore. Then how do we approach it right? Blaise was quiet for a moment, considering. As we start with questions, we ask Potter what he actually knows about his parents' death beyond the basic story. We point out the inconsistencies in the official version, and we suggest that maybe, just maybe, not everyone who claims to have his best interests at heart is telling him the truth. Hermione pulled out a piece of parchment and began making notes. We need to be systematic about this. What does Harry know versus what he's been told? What are the gaps in the official story? What questions should he be asking? And we need to prepare for the possibility that Black will make contact on his own, Blaise added. If our theory is correct, if he is trying to reach Potter, then we should be ready to help facilitate that meeting rather than let it happen by chance. You're talking about deliberately arranging a meeting between Harry and an escaped prisoner. I'm talking about reuniting a boy with his godfather and giving both of them the chance to learn the truth. Blaise's voice carried absolute conviction. Potter has the right to hear Black's side of the story, and Black has the right to defend himself after 12 years of imprisonment without trial. Hermione studied his face, seeing her own determination reflected there. And if we're wrong, if Black really is dangerous, then we'll be there to protect Potter. But I don't think we're wrong, Hermione. The pattern is too clear, the cover-up too systematic. Dumbledore has been orchestrating Potter's isolation since birth, and Sirius Black's imprisonment is just another piece of that orchestration. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the grounds in pristine white that made everything look clean and innocent. But beneath that surface purity, Hermione knew, lay the same ancient stones that had witnessed decades of Dumbledore's manipulation. We'll need to be more careful than ever, she said finally. If we're right about this, if Dumbledore really did condemn an innocent man to maintain control over Harry, then he won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to prevent that truth from coming out. Which is why we move quickly but carefully. We approach Potter before Dumbledore realizes what we've discovered. We present him with the facts and let him make his own choice about whether to trust Black or continue trusting the man who put him in prison. Hermione gathered their research materials, her mind already racing ahead to their next conversation with Harry. He's going to be devastated. Everything he believes about his parents' death, about his godfather, about Dumbledore's protection, it's all going to crumble. Better that he learn the truth and have the chance to rebuild his beliefs on solid ground than continue living a lie that serves only Dumbledore's agenda. As they prepared to leave the library, Hermione found herself thinking about trust, how easily it could be given, how thoroughly it could be exploited, and how devastating it could be when it was finally broken. Harry had trusted Dumbledore completely, had built his entire identity around that trust. But perhaps, she thought, as they made their way through the snow-covered corridors, it was time for Harry to learn the difference between trust that was earned and trust that was manipulated, and perhaps it was time for Sirius Black to finally have the chance to tell his story. The charmed galleon in her pocket grew warm as Blaise sent their agreed-upon signal. Tomorrow, they would approach Harry with their discoveries about his godfather. Tomorrow, they would begin the process of giving Harry Potter back a piece of his family that had been stolen from him 12 years ago. The thought both thrilled and terrified her. But as she watched Blaise disappear into the shadows of the dungeon corridor, Hermione knew they had no choice. The truth, however painful, what was always better than the most comfortable lie. Chapter 6. Christmas Revelations. The great hall felt cavernous, with only a dozen students scattered across the 4 house tables. Christmas at Hogwarts always had a peculiar quality, simultaneously cozy and lonely, festive and melancholy. This year, Harry found himself grateful for the near-empty castle. It meant fewer eyes watching him, fewer people to notice the way he'd been questioning everything he thought he knew about his life. Hermione sat across from him at the Gryffindor table, picking at her Christmas pudding with unusual distraction. She'd volunteered to stay at Hogwarts for the holidays, claiming she needed access to the library for her increasingly complex research projects. Harry suspected there was more to it than that, and especially given the meaningful looks she'd been exchanging with Blaise Zabini, who sat alone at the Slytherin table. The past 3 weeks had been strange ones. Ever since that conversation in the common room about Dumbledore's choices, Harry found himself noticing things he'd never paid attention to before. The way Dumbledore's eyes always seemed to be calculating something when they spoke. The way crucial information was always withheld until after Harry had already risked his life. The way adults who claimed to care about him consistently guided him toward danger rather than safety. "Harry," Hermione said quietly, glancing around the nearly empty hall. "Could we talk? Privately?" He nodded, his stomach clenching with a mixture of anticipation and dread. That these private conversations with Hermione had become increasingly difficult to bear. Each one revealed new layers of manipulation, new reasons to doubt the adults he'd been taught to trust. They made their way to the room of requirement, which had become their unofficial meeting place for sensitive discussions. Blaise was already there, sitting in one of the comfortable armchairs that the room had provided. His usual composure seemed strained, and Harry noticed he was holding a letter written on expensive parchment. "My mother's latest correspondence arrived this morning," Blaise said without preamble. "She's been investigating the Potters' final weeks, the information she's uncovered. Harry, you need to know what really happened before your parents went into hiding." Harry settled into the chair across from them, or trying to prepare himself for whatever new horror they were about to reveal. "What did she find?" Blaise unfolded the letter carefully, as if it contained something fragile and dangerous. "Your parents didn't choose the Fidelius charm immediately. That was Dumbledore's suggestion, made only after he convinced them that the other protective measures they were considering wouldn't be sufficient." "What other measures?" "Relocation charms that would have made their house untraceable to anyone not personally invited. Ward schemes that could have protected the entire village of Godric's Hollow. Even international relocation. My mother says the American ministry offered your family sanctuary under their witness protection program." Harry felt the blood drain from his face. They could have left Britain? They could have disappeared completely, Hermione said gently, hidden so thoroughly that Voldemort would never have found them. But Dumbledore convinced them that running was cowardly, that they had a duty to remain in Britain and continue fighting. He told them that the Fidelius charm was the perfect solution, Blaise continued, consulting his mother's letter. A way to stay and fight while remaining completely protected. He personally recommended that they use Sirius Black as their secret keeper, knowing that everyone would expect that choice. But they changed it to Peter Pettigrew at the last minute, Harry said slowly, remembering the story he'd been told. Sirius thought it would be more unexpected. Yes, and do you know who suggested that change? Blaise's voice was deadly quiet. Harry's heart began to race. Who? According to my mother's sources, people who were there, people who heard the conversations, it was Dumbledore who suggested that Black might be too obvious a choice. Dumbledore who mentioned that perhaps a less likely candidate would be safer. The words hit Harry like physical blows. He suggested Peter? Indirectly, carefully, the way he always makes suggestions, by asking leading questions that guide people toward the conclusions he wants them to reach. Hermione's voice was tight with controlled fury. Your parents thought they were making their own choice, but they were being manipulated into selecting the one person Dumbledore knew would betray them. That's impossible. Harry's voice came out as barely a whisper. Or Dumbledore couldn't have known Peter would turn traitor. Blaise exchanged a loaded glance with Hermione before continuing. Harry, Peter Pettigrew was captured by Death Eaters 3 months before your parents went into hiding. He was questioned, broken, and turned. The Order of the Phoenix knew this. They had intelligence suggesting that at least one of their members had been compromised. But they didn't know which one, Hermione added. There were suspicions about several people, including Pettigrew. Those suspicions were reported to Dumbledore. Harry felt the world tilting around him. You're saying Dumbledore knew Peter might be compromised when he suggested using him as secret keeper? I'm saying Dumbledore had very good reasons to suspect Peter's loyalty, and he guided your parents toward choosing him anyway. Blaise's voice carried absolute conviction. Your parents died because Dumbledore needed a martyred hero and a traumatized weapon, and arranging their deaths served both purposes. The silence that followed was deafening. Harry stared at his hands, trying to process the magnitude of what they were telling him. His parents, young, brave, trusting, had been led to their deaths by the man they thought was protecting them. And Harry himself, their infant son, had been the ultimate prize Dumbledore had been playing for. The blood protection, he said finally, his voice hollow. My mother's sacrifice. That was real, wasn't it? The magic was real, Hermione said softly. Lily's love did protect you, but Harry, that protection could have been invoked in any number of ways. But it didn't require her death, it required her willing sacrifice. If your family had been properly hidden, if adequate protections had been in place, she could have saved you without dying. But Dumbledore needed her to die, Harry realized with sickening clarity. He needed the story, the tragic sacrifice, the orphaned hero who would be grateful for any guidance, any approval, any scrap of affection. He needed you dependent and controllable, Blaise confirmed. A boy who would do anything to prove himself worthy of the love his parents died to give him. Harry stood abruptly and began pacing, his hands clenched into fists. Everything about his life, his childhood with the Dursleys, his desperate hunger for approval, his willingness to throw himself into danger for others, it had all been deliberately orchestrated. He was living a life designed by Albus Dumbledore to serve Albus Dumbledore's purposes. 13 years, he said, his voice shaking with rage. 13 years of believing that my parents died to save me, when really they died because Dumbledore needed them to die. Harry, no. He spun to face them, his eyes blazing. Don't try to soften it. Don't try to make it less horrible than it is. That man murdered my parents as surely as if he'd cast the killing curse himself. And then he placed me with people who would abuse me, isolate me, make me desperate for the approval of the very man who orchestrated my orphaning." Hermione's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Harry. I'm so sorry we had to be the ones to tell you this." "I'm not sorry you told me," Harry said fiercely. "I'm grateful. For the first time in my life, I understand what actually happened to my family. For the first time, I can see the pattern." He continued pacing, his mind racing through memory after memory, viewing each one through this new lens. "Every time I've faced danger, every crisis I've survived, he's been pulling the strings. First year with the stone, second year with the chamber, this year with the Dementors. He lets me stumble into these situations, lets me nearly die, and then arrives just in time to offer cryptic wisdom and praise my bravery. Building your trust and dependence," Blaise said grimly, "making sure you associate survival with his guidance." "And what's the end game?" Harry stopped pacing and faced them directly. "What does he ultimately want from me?" "We don't know yet," Hermione admitted. "But based on the historical pattern, he wants me to die gloriously for some cause he deems worthy," Harry finished, "just like James Clearwater, just like the McKinnons, just like all the others." The three of them sat in heavy silence, the weight of their discoveries settling like a shroud over the room. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the grounds in deceptive purity. Harry thought about how appropriate that was, beautiful surfaces concealing rot underneath. "What do I do now?" he asked finally. "How do I continue living at this school, taking his classes, pretending to respect him, when I know what he is?" "Carefully," Blaise said immediately. "Dumbledore has been playing this game for decades. If he realizes you've seen through his manipulations, or he'll find ways to regain control or remove you from the board entirely." "You need to appear to still trust him," Hermione added reluctantly, "at least until we can figure out a way to get you safely away from his influence." "Away from Hogwarts? Away from Britain, if necessary," Blaise said grimly. "My mother has contacts throughout Europe. The Bulgarian minister is no friend to Dumbledore. There are old grudges from the Grindelwald War. If we can build a case, if we can gather enough evidence—" "You're talking about political asylum." "I'm talking about freedom," Blaise corrected. "The chance to live your own life, rather than the one Dumbledore has scripted for you." Harry considered this, the concept of true freedom both terrifying and intoxicating. And what about everyone else? What about all the other students he might be manipulating? What about the next chosen one he decides to sacrifice? "We expose him," Hermione said firmly. "We gather evidence, we document his methods, and we make sure the wizarding world knows what he really is." "But that's a long-term goal," Blaise cautioned. "In the short term, we need to focus on keeping you safe and aware. No more rushing into danger because adults suggest it. No more accepting cryptic guidance without questioning the motives behind it. And no more trusting anyone who claims to have your best interests at heart without proving it through actions," Hermione added. Harry nodded slowly, feeling something fundamental shift inside him. The boy who had desperately sought approval from authority figures was gone. In his place was someone harder, warier, more determined to make his own choices about his own life. "There's something else," he said quietly. "Something I should have mentioned earlier. I've been having dreams. Strange dreams about a man I don't recognize. Someone who seems to know things about my parents, about what really happened that night." Hermione and Blaise exchanged another meaningful look. "Harry," Hermione said carefully, "can you describe this man? Thin, pale, with long dark hair and grey eyes. He looks haunted, like he's been through something terrible." Harry frowned, trying to recall the details. "In the dreams he keeps trying to tell me something, but I can never quite hear what he's saying." That sounds like, Blaise began, then stopped himself. Like who? Like Sirius Black, Hermione finished quietly. Harry, what if those aren't dreams? What if your godfather is trying to contact you? The possibility hit Harry like lightning. You think Sirius is innocent? We think Sirius never had a trial, Blaise said carefully. We think he was condemned without ever having the chance to tell his side of the story, and we think Dumbledore made sure of that. Harry stared at them, pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. If Sirius is innocent, if he didn't betray my parents, then everything I've been told about that night is a lie. Not everything, Hermione said gently. Your parents still loved you. Your mother still died to save you. But the rest of it, the betrayal, the guilt, the story that's shaped your entire identity, yes, that might all be lies. Harry felt tears he hadn't shed since childhood, burning behind his eyes. I need to see him. I need to hear the truth from him directly. We'll find a way, Blaise promised. But Harry, you have to understand, if we're right about this, if Sirius is innocent and trying to reach you, then Dumbledore will do anything to prevent that contact, including putting you in more danger if necessary. Then we'll have to be smarter than he is, Harry said firmly. We'll have to give my godfather the chance to tell me what really happened the night my parents died. As they sat together in the room of requirement, planning and strategizing, Harry felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Not the desperate hope for approval or acceptance he'd carried since childhood, but the calm hope of someone who finally understood his situation and was preparing to change it. Dumbledore had spent 13 years shaping Harry into a weapon for his own purposes. Now it was time for Harry to choose what kind of person he wanted to become instead. Chapter 7. The Buckbeak Gambit. The fire in Hagrid's hut crackled weakly, casting dancing shadows across the stone walls as Hagrid poured them another cup of tea with hands that trembled visibly. The gamekeeper's massive frame seemed diminished somehow, hunched over the scarred wooden table, as if carrying an invisible weight. Committee's made their decision, Hagrid said, his voice thick with barely contained emotion. Buckbeak's execution is set for sunset tomorrow. They're sending someone from the ministry, someone who specializes in... He couldn't finish the sentence. Harry felt rage burning in his chest, clean and pure and directed. 3 weeks had passed since Christmas, 3 weeks since he'd learned the truth about Dumbledore's manipulation of his parents' deaths. In that time, he'd begun to see patterns everywhere, and the pattern surrounding Buckbeak's case was particularly disturbing. This is wrong, he said firmly. Buckbeak was defending himself when he injured Malfoy. Any reasonable investigation would have concluded that. Aye, but Lucius Malfoy's got the Committee for Disposal of Dangerous Creatures in his pocket, Hagrid replied bitterly. Been planning this since the day Draco got scratched. Wanted me discredited. Wanted my classes shut down. Wanted... He trailed off, staring into the fire. Hermione reached across the table to squeeze Hagrid's massive hand. We won't let this happen, Hagrid. Like there has to be something we can do. Like what? Hagrid's laugh was hollow. I've exhausted every appeal, every legal avenue. Dumbledore himself tried to intervene, but even his influence has limits when Malfoy's involved. That was the part that bothered Harry most. Dumbledore's intervention had been carefully calculated, public enough to maintain his image as Hagrid's advocate, but ineffective enough to ensure the desired outcome. Harry was beginning to recognize the headmaster's signature technique, appearing to help while subtly ensuring failure. After they left Hagrid's hut, the three of them walked in silence toward the castle, each lost in their own thoughts. It wasn't until they reached the room of requirement that Blaise finally voiced what Harry suspected they were all thinking. Oh, he wants this to happen, Blaise said, without preamble, settling into his usual chair. Dumbledore wants Buckbeak executed. That's monstrous, Hermione protested, though her voice lacked conviction. Why would he want an innocent creature to die? Because he knows about the time turner, Harry said quietly, the realization crystallizing even as he spoke. He knows you have it, Hermione. He's been waiting for a situation traumatic enough to compel you to use it. Hermione's face went pale. You think he's orchestrating this to test the time turner? To see if I'll break the laws around time travel? I think he's creating a scenario where you'll feel morally obligated to break those laws, Blaise corrected. Think about it. Hagrid's beloved pet, condemned to die for defending itself against a spoiled brat's deliberate provocation. The execution timed perfectly for maximum emotional impact, and you, with the power to prevent it, but only by risking everything. It's another test, Harry realized. Like the Philosopher's Stone, like the Chamber of Secrets. He creates an impossible situation, provides us with the tools to solve it through dangerous means, and then steps back to see what we'll do. Hermione was quiet for a long moment, her brilliant mind clearly working through the implications. If I use the time turner to save Buckbeak, I'll be violating every regulation the Ministry has about time travel. I could be expelled, imprisoned, or worse. Which would serve Dumbledore's purposes perfectly, Blaise said grimly. Either you use it, and he gains valuable intelligence about time travel's potential, or you refuse and he learns the limits of your moral flexibility. But there's a third option, Harry said, feeling the familiar thrill of rebellion rising in his chest. We save Buckbeak without using the time turner. We solve this problem through our own methods, our own planning, without playing by his rules. How? Hermione asked. The execution is tomorrow at sunset. Buckbeak is being held in a ministry-secured area. We're students with no legal authority, no political influence. But we have something better, Blaise interrupted, his dark eyes gleaming with strategic possibility. We have intelligence, determination, and the element of surprise. Dumbledore expects you to use the time turner, because he's conditioned you to believe that magic is always the solution to magical problems, but sometimes the best solution is the most mundane one. Harry leaned forward intently. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Ministry security, however magical, still operates on predictable principles. Guards who follow schedules, wards that have specific parameters, procedures that can be subverted by people who understand how bureaucracy actually works. You're talking about a jailbreak, Hermione said, her voice somewhere between horrified and intrigued. I'm talking about a rescue, Blaise corrected smoothly. My mother has contacts in the Ministry, people who owe her favors, people who can provide information about guard rotations, ward specifications, transport schedules. We don't need to overpower the system. We just need to understand it well enough to circumvent it. Hermione stood and began pacing, her analytical mind clearly wrestling with the moral implications. We'd be breaking laws, serious laws. If we're caught, we'll be punished, Harry said simply. But Hermione, we're already taking risks every day just by questioning Dumbledore's methods. At least this way, we'd be taking risks for something we actually believe in. And we'd be proving something important, Blaise added. We'd be demonstrating that we can solve problems without adult guidance, without magical shortcuts, without playing by rules designed to benefit people who don't have our best interests at heart. Hermione stopped pacing and turned to face them. Now, you're asking me to abandon everything I've been taught about respecting authority and following proper procedures. I'm asking you to choose between blind obedience and conscious action, Harry replied. The same choice I had to make when I learned the truth about Dumbledore. The same choice we'll all have to make eventually. The room fell silent, except for the crackling of the fire Hermione had conjured. Harry watched his friend struggle with concepts that had once seemed absolute, right and wrong, legal and illegal, acceptable and forbidden. He understood the difficulty. 3 weeks ago, he would have been horrified by the idea of deliberately breaking Ministry regulations. But 3 weeks ago, he hadn't known that his entire life was built on lies orchestrated by the man he'd trusted most. "If we do this," Hermione said finally, "if we actually attempt to rescue Buckbeak, we do it properly. Full planning, careful intelligence gathering, multiple contingency plans. We don't improvise, we don't take unnecessary risks, and we accept that failure might mean consequences we can't undo." "Agreed," Harry said immediately. "And we understand that this changes everything," she continued. "Once we actively defy the Ministry, once we prove we're willing to break laws when we disagree with them, there's no going back. Dumbledore will know we're no longer controllable through conventional means." "Good," Blaise said with satisfaction. "Let him know. Let him understand that we're done being his chess pieces." Hermione nodded slowly, her expression shifting from uncertainty to determined resolve. "Then we save Buckbeak, not because Dumbledore expects us to, or not because we're following his implicit guidance, but because it's the right thing to do and we have the power to do it." Harry felt something profound settle in his chest, a sense of agency he'd never experienced before. For the first time in his life, he was making a choice that served no one's agenda, but his own conscience. No adult had suggested this course of action. No authority figure had provided cryptic guidance pointing them in this direction. This was their decision, made for their reasons, to be executed through their methods. "When do we start?" he asked. "Now," Blaise replied, already reaching for parchment and quill. "My mother's contacts can provide the intelligence we need, but gathering and analyzing that information will take time. Hermione, I'll need you to research everything you can about Ministry holding procedures for condemned magical creatures. Harry, you'll need to scout the actual location where they're keeping Buckbeak." "And if someone asks why we're suddenly so interested in Ministry procedures," Hermione asked, "we tell them we're working on a research project about magical creature rights," Harry said, "which is technically true." As they began to plan in earnest, mapping out schedules and contingencies, Harry found himself thinking about choice and consequence. Dumbledore had spent years orchestrating situations where Harry's choices were illusions, carefully scripted scenarios designed to produce predetermined outcomes. The Philosopher's Stone, the Chamber of Secrets, even Harry's placement with the Dursleys, all of it had been designed to shape Harry into someone who would choose sacrifice over self-preservation, duty over personal happiness. But this choice was different. This choice was his own. "One more thing," he said, as they finalized their preliminary plans. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whatever consequences we face them together. No one takes the blame alone. No one gets sacrificed to protect the others." "Agreed," Hermione said firmly. "Agreed," Blaise echoed. Harry nodded, feeling the weight of true partnership settling around them like armor. They were no longer students being guided by adults with hidden agendas. They were allies, choosing their own battles and accepting their own risks. Tomorrow, they would find out whether their friendship was strong enough to challenge the system that had shaped their world. Tonight, for the first time in his life, Harry Potter was going to sleep, knowing that his choices were truly his own. The fire burned lower as they worked, casting their shadows long and sharp against the walls. Outside, the castle slept on, unaware that 3 of its students had just declared their independence from the very foundations of the world they'd been raised to accept. By tomorrow's sunset, either Buckbeak would be free, or they would all understand exactly what the cost of defiance could be. Either way, they would face that future as authors of their own destiny rather than characters in someone else's story. And that, Harry thought, as he watched his friends' faces in the firelight, what made any risk worth taking. Chapter 8. Confronting the Truth. The defense against the dark arts classroom felt different in the pale afternoon light filtering through the windows. Where once Harry had found Professor Lupin's office welcoming, with its warm lamplight and cups of tea shared over Patronus lessons, now he saw the careful staging of a performance designed to earn his trust. 3 days had passed since their successful rescue of Buckbeak. The hippogriff was now safely hidden in the Forbidden Forest, protected by wards Hermione had researched, and Blaise had helped implement using his family's knowledge of concealment magic. The Ministry believed the creature had been killed as scheduled, the fabricated evidence of his death carefully planted by Blaise's mother's contacts. But their victory had come with an unexpected revelation. During the rescue, they had discovered that Professor Lupin had been monitoring the situation far more closely than his public expressions of regret had suggested. Blaise's research into the security arrangements had uncovered correspondence between Lupin and Dumbledore, discussing the educational value of allowing the students to find their own solution to the moral crisis. Now, as Harry sat across from Lupin's desk with Hermione and Blaise flanking him, he felt the familiar cold anger that had become his constant companion since learning the truth about Dumbledore's manipulations. "Professor," Harry began, his voice carefully controlled, "we need to discuss what really happened with Buckbeak." Lupin looked up from the essays he was grading, his expression shifting from mild curiosity to something more guarded. "I'm not sure I understand, Harry. The execution proceeded as scheduled, unfortunately. There was nothing any of us could do to prevent it." "Except that's not true, is it?" Hermione said quietly. "The execution didn't proceed as scheduled. Buckbeak is alive, and you know it." The color drained from Lupin's face. For a moment, he seemed to be weighing his options, calculating how much they knew and how much he could safely deny. Finally, he set down his quill and looked at them directly. "How long have you known?" "Known what, specifically?" Blaise's voice carried the cold precision Harry had come to associate with his most damaging revelations. "That you've been reporting our activities to Dumbledore? That you knew we were planning to rescue Buckbeak and chose not to stop us? Or that you and the headmaster discussed the educational value of letting us believe we were acting independently while you monitored our every move?" Lupin closed his eyes briefly, suddenly looking far older than his 34 years. "You don't understand the complexities of the situation." "Then explain them to us," Harry said, his voice hard. "Explain how watching students risk imprisonment and expulsion for their moral convictions constitutes good teaching. Explain how letting us think we were defying adult authority, while secretly having that authority's permission, serves any educational purpose." "Harry, some lessons can only be learned through experience. You needed to discover your own moral courage, or your ability to act independently when faced with injustice. If we had simply told you these things, if we had guided you directly, you would have robbed us of the chance to develop genuine autonomy," Hermione finished, her voice tight with controlled fury. "Yes, Professor, we understand the theory. What we don't understand is how that justifies the deception. And more importantly," Harry added, "we don't understand how you can participate in Dumbledore's manipulations, knowing what they cost people. Knowing what they cost my parents." Lupin went very still. "What do you think you know about your parents?" "We know that Dumbledore guided them toward using Peter Pettigrew as their secret keeper, despite intelligence suggesting he'd been compromised," Blaise said flatly. "We know that safer alternatives were available and dismissed, and we know that their deaths served Dumbledore's larger strategic objectives. And we know," Harry said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, "that you were there. You were part of the Order. You knew Peter had been captured. You knew he might have been turned, and you said nothing when Dumbledore suggested him as secret keeper." The silence that followed was deafening. Lupin stared at his hands, the weight of 13 years of guilt and complicity written across his features. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "You can't possibly understand the pressures we were under. The war was going badly. People were dying every day, and we had to make impossible choices with incomplete information." "That's not an answer," Hermione said sharply. "That's an excuse." "Is it?" Lupin's head snapped up, his composure finally cracking. Do you know what it was like, watching your friends die one by one? Do you understand the kind of paranoia that consumed us all? We suspected everyone of being the spy, Harry. Everyone, including each other. But you suspected Peter specifically, Harry pressed. The intelligence about his capture existed. The concerns about his suitability were raised, and when Dumbledore guided my parents toward choosing him anyway, you stayed silent. Because I trusted Dumbledore's judgment, Lupin's voice rose, then immediately dropped as he seemed to remember where they were. Because he knew things the rest of us didn't. Because his strategic thinking had saved us countless times before. Because... He trailed off, the weakness of his own justifications becoming apparent even to him. Because it was easier to trust his judgment than to take responsibility for your own, Blaise said with surgical precision. Because questioning Dumbledore would have required moral courage you weren't prepared to summon. You think I haven't lived with that knowledge every day for 13 years? Lupin's voice cracked. You think I don't know that I failed them? That I failed you? Then why are you still doing it? Harry demanded. Why are you still participating in his manipulations? Why are you helping him orchestrate my education through crisis and trauma? Because the alternative is chaos. Lupin stood abruptly, beginning to pace behind his desk. Because without Dumbledore's guidance, without his strategic planning, the wizarding world would have fallen to Voldemort years ago. Because sometimes terrible choices serve necessary purposes. Whose purposes? Hermione asked quietly. Who decides what's necessary? Who determines which lives are acceptable losses for the greater good? People with the wisdom and experience to see the larger picture. People who understand the stakes involved. People like Dumbledore, Harry said flatly. Yes. The same person who orchestrated my parents' deaths to create a traumatized weapon. The same person who placed me with abusive relatives to ensure my desperate gratitude for any adult approval. The same person who has spent 13 years putting me in mortal danger to test my willingness to sacrifice myself for his vision of the greater good. Lupin stopped pacing. Harry, that's not... He cares about you. Everything he's done has been to prepare you for... For what? Harry's voice was deadly quiet. To die gloriously for his cause? To become another James Clearwater or Alice McKinnon or Prewett twin? Another brilliant young person who trusted his guidance unto death? To survive what's coming. To be strong enough to face the challenges that he's orchestrating. Harry stood as well, his control finally breaking. Professor, don't you see? He creates the challenges. He engineers the crisis. He sets up the scenarios that require heroic sacrifice, and then expresses regret when people die following his guidance. You're wrong, Lupin said, but his voice lacked conviction. Are we? Hermione's tone was gentle now, almost sympathetic. Professor, when was the last time Dumbledore prevented a crisis rather than managing one? When was the last time his guidance led someone to safety rather than danger? When was the last time he used his considerable power to protect rather than to position people for strategic sacrifice? Lupin sank back into his chair, the fight going out of him. You don't understand. The prophecy. What prophecy? Harry demanded. Lupin's eyes widened as he realized his slip. That's not... You're not supposed to know about that yet. But you do know about it, Blaise observed. You know there's some prophecy related to Harry, and you've been helping Dumbledore prepare him to fulfill it without telling him what it contains. Because the knowledge would be dangerous. Because knowing too much, too early, could compromise his willingness to play along, Harry finished. Or could make him ask inconvenient questions about whether fulfilling this prophecy is actually in his best interest or just in Dumbledore's. The silence stretched between them, heavy with the weight of truths too long suppressed. Finally, Lupin spoke, his voice barely audible. What would you have me do? Abandon everything I've believed for 13 years? Betray the man who saved the wizarding world? We'd have you choose courage over convenience, Hermione said softly. We'd have you stand up for what's right instead of what's expected. We'd have you be the adult Harry needed after his parents died instead of another instrument of his manipulation. It's not that simple. It is that simple, Harry said firmly. You either help perpetuate a system that treats children as expendable resources, or you don't. You either enable Dumbledore's manipulations, or you oppose them. There's no middle ground, Professor. Not anymore. Lupin was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the grounds where students were enjoying the February sunshine, blissfully unaware of the conversation taking place above them. Even if you're right about Dumbledore, he said finally, even if his methods are questionable, the alternative is worse. Without his guidance, without his strategic planning, Voldemort will return and destroy everything. Maybe, Harry said, or maybe we'll find better ways to oppose him than through manipulation and sacrifice. And maybe we'll build something worth protecting instead of just defending something rotten. And maybe you'll all die because you rejected the guidance of the one person powerful enough to help you survive what's coming. Harry looked at his defense professor. This man he had respected, trusted, even begun to see as a parental figure, and felt the last of his faith in adult authority crumble to dust. Professor, he said quietly, do you know what the difference is between you and Dumbledore? Lupin looked up, something like hope flickering in his eyes. Perhaps he thought Harry was about to acknowledge some moral distinction between the two men. Dumbledore believes his cause justifies his methods. You know his methods are wrong, but you follow them anyway because you're too frightened to take responsibility for your own moral choices. The hope died in Lupin's eyes. Harry! No! Harry turned toward the door, Hermione and Blaise rising to follow him. We're done here. We're done with adults who claim to care about us while engineering our suffering. We're done with people who say they're protecting us while ensuring our isolation and trauma. At the door, he paused and looked back at Lupin, who sat hunched behind his desk like a broken thing. When this is over, Professor, when the truth comes out about what Dumbledore has been doing and what it's cost, I hope you remember this conversation. I hope you remember that you had the chance to choose courage and chose comfort instead. As they left the defense classroom, Harry felt the last chains of his childhood innocence fall away. He had entered that room still hoping that some adult, somewhere, would prove worthy of the trust he had once given so freely. Now he understood the truth that Blaise and Hermione had been trying to help him see. In a world where adults served their own interests above all else, children had to protect themselves. Are you all right? Hermione asked, as they walked through the corridors toward Gryffindor Tower. No, Harry said honestly. But I will be. We will be. Just us? Blaise asked. Just us, Harry confirmed. From now on we rely on each other. We make our own choices. We accept our own consequences. And we never, ever trust anyone who claims to know what's best for us better than we do. It was a hard lesson, or bought with the pain of disillusionment and betrayal, but as they walked through Hogwarts, that ancient seat of learning and tradition, Harry found himself thinking that perhaps the most important education was the one that taught you to think for yourself, even if, especially if, that thinking led you away from everything you had been taught to believe. Chapter 9. The Pettigrew Problem. The abandoned classroom on the 7th floor had become their unofficial headquarters, warded with every concealment charm Hermione could research and every privacy enchantment Blaise's mother had taught him through their correspondence. Tonight, it served as both prison and courtroom, though the trembling man huddled in the corner looked more like a cornered rat than a dangerous criminal. Peter Pettigrew sat bound by magical restraints. his watery eyes darting between the 3 students who had orchestrated his capture with a precision that would have impressed aura trainers. The plan had taken weeks to execute, tracking his movements through the castle in his animagus form, predicting his patterns, and finally cornering him in the very corridor where Harry's parents had once walked as students. "Please," Pettigrew whimpered, his voice thin and reedy. "You don't understand. I never wanted to betray James and Lily. I was forced. Voldemort would have killed me if I refused." Harry stared down at the man who had cost him his parents, his childhood, his entire life as he might have lived it. 3 weeks ago, he would have felt overwhelming rage. 3 weeks ago, he would have wanted nothing more than to see this traitor punished for his crimes. Now, having learned the truth about Dumbledore's manipulations, Harry found his anger was more complex, his desire for justice tempered by strategic considerations that his younger self would never have entertained. "You were captured by Death Eaters 3 months before my parents went into hiding," Harry said quietly, consulting the notes Blaise's research had compiled. "You were questioned, broken, and turned. The Order suspected you might be compromised." "That's not, I never—" "And Dumbledore knew," Hermione added, her voice carrying the weight of documentation they had gathered. "He had intelligence reports suggesting at least one Order member had been compromised. Your name was specifically mentioned as a possibility." Pettigrew's face went white. "You can't prove that." Blaise stepped forward, they holding a piece of parchment bearing official ministry seals. "Actually, we can. My mother's contacts provided us with copies of the original intelligence reports. Your capture by Death Eaters was documented. Your suspicious behavior afterward was noted. And Dumbledore received detailed briefings about your possible betrayal." "Then why didn't he stop me?" Pettigrew's voice cracked. "If he knew I might be turned, why didn't he remove me from the operation?" "Because he needed my parents to die," Harry said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "He needed a martyred hero and a traumatized weapon. Your betrayal served his purposes perfectly." The silence that followed was broken only by Pettigrew's ragged breathing. Harry watched the man who had shaped his entire life through a single act of cowardice, and felt an unexpected stirring of something that might have been pity. "What do we do with him?" Hermione asked quietly. It was the question that had been haunting them since they had finalized their capture plans. Pettigrew represented both an opportunity and a moral test. His testimony could clear Sirius Black's name and expose Dumbledore's complicity in the Potters' deaths, but using him strategically would mean delaying justice for the families destroyed by his cowardice. "We turn him in," Harry said immediately. "We give him to the Ministry, let him face trial for his crimes. Sirius will be cleared, the truth will come out, and justice will be served." "Will it?" Blaise asked softly. "Harry, think about who controls the Ministry. Think about who has the power to shape narratives, suppress evidence, ensure that inconvenient truths never reach public attention." Harry felt a chill of understanding. Dumbledore. Exactly. If we turn Pettigrew over through official channels, Dumbledore will find ways to control his testimony. The truth about the Potters' deaths might be buried again, this time permanently. Sirius might be cleared, but the larger pattern of manipulation will remain hidden. Hermione was already pacing, her analytical mind working through possibilities. But if we keep him, if we use him strategically to gather more evidence, to build an unassailable case against Dumbledore, we become like them, Harry finished. We start treating people as chess pieces to be moved around for our convenience. Or we become smart enough to win, Blaise countered. Harry, I understand your desire for immediate justice. But think about the bigger picture. How many other families has Dumbledore manipulated into tragedy? How many future victims could we prevent by exposing his methods completely? Harry looked down at Pettigrew, who was watching their debate with the desperate attention of a man whose fate hung in the balance. The strategic argument made sense. Blaise was right that turning Pettigrew in immediately might allow Dumbledore to control the narrative, But something deeper in Harry rebelled against the idea of becoming another manipulator, even for noble purposes. "Peter," Harry said, addressing the cowering man directly, "tell me about the night my parents died." I can't. It's too—" "Tell me," Harry repeated, his voice carrying quiet authority. "You owe them that much." Pettigrew's shoulders shook as he began to speak, his voice barely above a whisper. "They trusted me. James called me one of his closest friends. Lily baked me birthday cakes, invited me for Christmas dinner. They never suspected, never imagined, that you would sell them to their murderer for your own skin," Hermione said coldly. "I was terrified!" Pettigrew's voice rose to a wail. "You don't understand what it was like, what Voldemort was capable of, the things I saw them do to people who refused, so you chose to let it be done to my parents instead," Harry said. "I hoped, maybe James could fight him off. He was so powerful, so brave. I thought if I just gave them the location, maybe what? Maybe Voldemort would just have a chat with them?" Harry's voice remained deadly calm, but his eyes blazed with controlled fury. "You knew exactly what you were condemning them to." Pettigrew collapsed into sobbing silence, the weight of 13 years of guilt finally breaking through his walls of rationalization and self-pity. Harry watched him for a long moment, then turned to face his friends. "We turn him in. Tonight. But we do it our way." "Meaning?" Blaise asked. "Meaning we don't go through Dumbledore or the ministry bureaucracy that he controls. We go directly to someone with the authority and integrity to ensure proper justice." Harry's expression hardened with resolve. "We go to Madame Bones." Hermione's eyes widened with understanding. "Amelia Bones, the head of the Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes, but also one of the few ministry officials with a reputation for absolute incorruptibility. And someone who has been asking uncomfortable questions about Dumbledore's methods since the Triwizard Tournament debacle," Blaise added, consulting his mental catalogue of ministry politics. "My mother mentioned that Bones has been conducting quiet investigations into several suspicious decisions made during the war. She'll ensure Pettigrew gets a fair trial with Veritaserum," Harry said firmly. "She'll make sure his testimony about my parents' deaths is properly recorded and investigated. And she'll have the authority to demand answers from everyone involved, including Dumbledore." "And if Dumbledore tries to interfere?" Hermione asked. "Then Madame Bones will want to know why," Harry replied. "And that will raise exactly the kinds of questions we want raised." Blaise was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing the strategic implications. Finally, he nodded slowly. "It's not the approach I would have chosen, but it has merit. Bones has the reputation and authority to protect Pettigrew long enough for proper justice to be served. And if Dumbledore does try to interfere, it will expose him more effectively than any careful manipulation on our part," Hermione finished, her expression brightening with understanding. Harry felt something settle in his chest, a sense of rightness that had been absent from so many decisions in his life. For once he was choosing based on his own moral convictions rather than strategic calculation or adult guidance. "Peter," he said, addressing the trembling man again, "you have one chance to do the right thing, one chance to make amends for what you've done. You're going to tell Madame Bones everything, about your betrayal, about Voldemort's methods, about every detail of what happened that night, and you're going to do it under Veritaserum, so there can be no doubt about the truth. And if I refuse?" Harry's smile was sharp as winter steel. "Then you can try to explain to the Dementors why you've been hiding as a rat for 13 years, while an innocent man suffered in Azkaban for your crimes." Pettigrew's face went grey with terror. "You can't. You wouldn't." "I would," Harry said simply. "But I'd rather you choose to do the right thing because it's right, not because you're afraid of the consequences." They moved through the castle like shadows, or using every concealment technique they had learned over months of secret meetings. The flu connection to the Ministry was accessible through Professor McGonagall's office, warded and monitored, but not impossible to breach for students with sufficient motivation and skill. An hour later, they stood in the austere waiting room outside Madame Bones's office, their captured prisoner still bound and trembling between them. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes operated around the clock, and Amelia Bones was known for her willingness to take emergency appointments when genuine crises arose. "Are you certain about this?" Blaise asked quietly, as they waited for the secretary to announce their presence. "Yes," Harry said without hesitation. "For the first time since I learned the truth about Dumbledore, and I'm absolutely certain we're doing the right thing." When they were finally ushered into Madame Bones's office, Harry felt the weight of history settling around them. This was the moment when the lies would finally be exposed, when justice would finally be served, when Sirius Black would finally be free. But more than that, this was the moment when Harry Potter chose his own path forward, not the path Dumbledore had laid out for him, not the path that served strategic advantage, but the path that honored the memory of his parents and the principles they had died defending. As Madame Bones looked up from her desk, her keen eyes taking in their unusual delegation and their trembling prisoner, Harry stepped forward to finally tell the truth about the night his world had been destroyed, and for the first time in his life. He was telling that truth in service of justice rather than manipulation, in pursuit of what was right rather than what was expedient. It felt like coming home to a version of himself he had never known he could be. Chapter 10. Dumbledore's Counter-Move. The summons to the headmaster's office arrived during breakfast, delivered by a stern-faced Professor McGonagall, who avoided Harry's eyes as she handed him the parchment. Around him, the great hall buzzed with whispered speculation about the events of 3 days ago, Peter Pettigrew's dramatic arrest, Sirius Black's impending exoneration, and the uncomfortable questions being raised about certain wartime decisions. Harry folded the parchment slowly, acutely aware that this moment had been inevitable since they had chosen to act independently. Dumbledore had lost control of his most valuable asset, and men like Albus Dumbledore did not surrender control without a fight. "Harry," Hermione said quietly, leaning toward him from across the table, "do you want us to come with you?" "No." Harry's voice was firm. "This is something I need to face alone. But stay together, both of you. I suspect this meeting is only the opening move." Blaise, who had been unusually quiet since receiving an owl from his mother that morning, simply nodded. The elegant Slytherin looked troubled in a way that suggested their victory over Pettigrew had come with complications Harry hadn't yet learned about. The walk to Dumbledore's office felt longer than usual, each step echoing through corridors that suddenly seemed more oppressive than welcoming. The gargoyle stepped aside at the familiar password, and Harry climbed the spiral staircase with the measured pace of someone approaching an execution. Dumbledore sat behind his desk exactly as he always did, his fingers steepled, his blue eyes twinkling with that familiar mixture of warmth and calculation. But Harry, armed now with months of hard-won understanding, could see the steel beneath the grandfatherly facade. "Harry, my boy," Dumbledore said, his voice carrying its usual gentle warmth, "please sit. We have much to discuss." Harry remained standing. "Professor, I must confess, I am deeply concerned about the events of recent days. Peter Pettigrew's capture and subsequent confession have raised troubling questions, not only about past decisions, but about present circumstances." Dumbledore's eyes studied Harry with uncomfortable intensity. "I understand you played a central role in these developments." "I helped deliver a criminal to justice," Harry said carefully. "I thought that would be considered commendable." "Indeed, and your courage and determination do you credit. However, I find myself wondering about the influences that may have shaped your recent actions." Dumbledore leaned back in his chair, his expression growing subtly more serious. "Tell me, Harry, What do you know of Blaise Zabini's family history? The change of subject was so abrupt it might have caught Harry off guard 3 months ago. Now he recognized it as a classic Dumbledore maneuver, deflection masked as gentle concern. "I know Mr. Zabini has been a loyal friend when I needed one most," Harry replied evenly. "Loyalty is indeed precious, but it can be complicated when it comes from certain quarters." Dumbledore's tone remained gentle, but Harry could hear the warning beneath it. The Zabini family has a long history of playing multiple sides in any conflict, Harry. They survived the last war by providing information to whoever could best protect their interests. Are you suggesting that Blaise is some kind of spy? I am suggesting that a young man raised in such an environment might not view loyalty in quite the same way you do. The recent campaign against certain established authorities bears all the hallmarks of Zabini family methodology. Harry felt anger stirring in his chest, clean and righteous. You mean it bears the hallmarks of thinking for myself instead of blindly following guidance from adults who claim to know what's best for me? Harry, Dumbledore's voice carried a note of gentle reproof. I understand your frustration with the complexities of adult decision-making. The choices faced during wartime are often impossible ones, requiring sacrifices that seem incomprehensible to those who haven't borne such responsibility. Like sacrificing my parents to create a traumatized weapon? The words hung in the air like a curse. For the first time in Harry's memory, Dumbledore's expression showed genuine surprise, though it was quickly masked by calculated sadness. I see that young Mr. Zabini and Miss Granger have been sharing certain interpretations of historical events with you. Interpretations that, while understandably compelling to a young mind seeking simple answers, may not reflect the full complexity of the situation. They shared documented evidence, Harry said flatly. Intelligence reports showing that Peter Pettigrew was suspected of being compromised, records of safer alternatives that were available to my parents, proof that you guided them toward the choice that served your purposes, rather than their safety. Documents can be taken out of context, Harry. Intelligence reports from wartime are often incomplete or misleading, and the alternatives you mention? Dumbledore sighed deeply. Each carried risks of its own. The decision to trust Peter Pettigrew was made in good faith, based on the information available at the time. Information that included specific warnings about his potential betrayal. Suspicions, not certainties. In war, one cannot act on mere suspicions without destroying the very bonds of trust that make resistance possible. Dumbledore leaned forward, his eyes carrying that familiar weight of paternal concern. Harry, I fear your new friends have encouraged you to view past events through the lens of present knowledge, leading to conclusions that, while emotionally satisfying, may not reflect historical reality. Harry stared at the man who had shaped his entire life, feeling a mixture of rage and something that might have been pity. Even now, faced with overwhelming evidence of his manipulation, Dumbledore couldn't abandon his role as the wise mentor, guiding a confused child. Professor, Harry said quietly, do you actually believe what you're saying? Do you really think I'm just a confused boy being led astray by clever manipulators? Or are you simply hoping I'm still naive enough to accept your justifications? For a moment, something flickered behind Dumbledore's eyes. Perhaps surprise, perhaps calculation, perhaps even respect. But when he spoke, his voice maintained its gentle authority. I believe you are a remarkable young man facing extraordinarily difficult circumstances. I believe you have been exposed to perspectives designed to undermine your trust in those who care most about your welfare. And I believe that certain individuals may be using your natural desire for independence to serve purposes you may not fully understand. Such as, consider, Harry, how convenient it has been for the Zabini family that your recent actions have disrupted established security measures and exposed sensitive intelligence networks. Consider how Miss Granger's exceptional research skills have been directed toward undermining ministry protocols rather than advancing her own academic interests. Consider how your own moral courage has been channeled toward defying authority rather than working within established systems. Harry felt a chill of uncertainty, not because he believed Dumbledore's implications, but because he recognized the skilled way they had been constructed. This was how Dumbledore worked, not through lies, but through carefully selected truths arranged to support false conclusions. You're suggesting my friends are using me. I am suggesting that friendship, particularly among the young, can be a complex thing. True friends seek to protect each other from harm, even when that protection requires difficult conversations about uncomfortable truths. Dumbledore's expression grew sorrowful. I fear that your current associates, however well-intentioned, may be placing you in danger for reasons that serve their own family interests rather than your welfare. The door to the office opened, and Professor Snape entered with his usual dramatic flourish. Harry noticed immediately that the potions master looked uncommonly satisfied about something. "Ah, Severus," Dumbledore said without surprise. "I trust your conversation with Miss Granger was illuminating?" Harry's blood turned to ice. "What conversation?" "Miss Granger was called to Professor Snape's office to discuss certain irregularities in her recent research activities," Dumbledore explained gently. "Activities that may have inadvertently compromised student safety protocols." "Where is she?" Harry's voice carried a dangerous edge. "Being counseled about the potential consequences of her actions," Snape said smoothly. "The girl's parents have been contacted regarding her recent difficulties with authority. They are quite concerned about the influences she has encountered this year." The threat was clear and carefully crafted. Hermione's parents, lacking knowledge of the wizarding world's complexities, could easily be convinced that their daughter was in danger from bad influences at school. The threat of removal from Hogwarts, or worse, to having her memory modified for her own safety, would be devastatingly effective. "And Mr. Zabini," Dumbledore continued, "has received word from his mother expressing concern about his recent associations. It seems that certain political considerations may require him to distance himself from activities that could compromise the family's carefully maintained neutrality." Harry felt the trap closing around him, elegant and ruthless in its precision. His friends were being systematically isolated, pressured by the very authorities who claimed to have their best interests at heart. And Harry himself was being offered a simple choice: abandon his allies and return to Dumbledore's guidance, or watch them suffer consequences for their loyalty. "You're threatening them," Harry said quietly. "I am protecting all of you," Dumbledore replied with perfect sincerity, "from forces and influences that could cause irreparable harm to your futures. Harry, I understand your anger, your desire for independence, your frustration with adult authority. These are natural feelings for someone your age. But acting on them without proper guidance can lead to consequences that extend far beyond yourself." Harry stood in the headmaster's office, surrounded by the artifacts of centuries of accumulated power and authority, and made a choice that would define the rest of his life. "No," he said simply. "Harry, no, Professor. I won't abandon my friends. I won't return to being your obedient weapon. And I won't pretend that your manipulation serves anyone's interests but your own." Harry met Dumbledore's eyes directly, or seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. "You can threaten Hermione's parents, you can pressure Blaise's family, you can make our lives as difficult as you want, but you can't make us abandon each other." Dumbledore sighed deeply, the expression of a man forced to contemplate unpleasant necessities. "I hoped it would not come to this, Harry, but if you insist on pursuing a course that endangers yourself and others, then we'll face those consequences together," Harry said firmly, "just like we've faced everything else." He turned toward the door, then paused and looked back at the two men who had shaped so much of his suffering. "Professor Dumbledore, Professor Snape," he said politely, "I want you to understand something. You've spent yours teaching me that my value comes from my willingness to sacrifice myself for others. But my friends have taught me something different, that I'm valuable just as I am, and that real friendship means protecting each other rather than using each other. Harry opened the door and stepped into the corridor, feeling lighter than he had in months, despite the threats hanging over them. Behind him, he heard Snape's voice, cold and cutting. The boy has learned defiance well, Albus. Perhaps too well. And Dumbledore's reply, tired and calculating. Indeed, we may need to consider alternative approaches. Harry smiled as he walked toward the room of requirement, where he knew his friends would be waiting. Let Dumbledore consider all the alternatives he wanted. Harry Potter had finally learned the difference between wisdom and manipulation, between guidance and control, between protection and imprisonment. And he had learned something even more important, that some things were worth fighting for, even when the odds were impossibly stacked against you, especially when you weren't fighting alone. Chapter 11. The network expands. The room of requirement had transformed itself into something resembling a cozy common room, with comfortable chairs arranged in a circle and a warm fire crackling in the hearth. But the gathering that had assembled there on this grey March evening was unlike any that Hogwarts had seen in recent memory. Students from different houses, different years, different backgrounds, all united by a growing understanding that the foundations of their world were built on lies. Harry sat beside Hermione and Blaise, watching as their small alliance of three had somehow grown into a movement that none of them had anticipated. Word had spread quietly through the castle over the past weeks, whispered conversations in corridors, meaningful looks exchanged during meals, careful questions posed during study sessions. The truth about Sirius Black's exoneration and Peter Pettigrew's confession had raised uncomfortable questions that couldn't be easily dismissed. "I've been thinking about what you said," Luna Lovegood began, her dreamy voice somehow managing to command attention despite its soft tone. The second-year Ravenclaw sat curled in her chair like a cat, her pale blue eyes fixed on something just beyond the visible. About patterns of manipulation, about people being guided toward conclusions that serve others' purposes. Harry nodded encouragingly. That Luna had approached them 3 days ago with observations that had made his blood run cold, not because they were shocking, but because they were so obviously true once pointed out. "My father receives many letters," Luna continued. "People write to the Quibbler about strange experiences, about feeling like they're being watched or guided or arranged. Most people dismiss these stories as delusions or conspiracy theories. But lately, I've been wondering if some of them might be telling a different kind of truth." "What kind of stories?" Hermione asked, her research instincts clearly engaged. "Stories about children who died young after receiving special attention from respected adults. Stories about families who suffered convenient tragedies after asking too many questions. Or stories about patterns of misfortune that always seem to serve larger purposes." Luna's voice remained dreamy, but her words carried a weight that made everyone in the circle lean forward. "I've started collecting them, cataloguing them. The pattern is extensive." Neville shifted uncomfortably in his chair, then spoke up with more confidence than Harry had ever heard from him. "My grandmother has been asking questions too, about why certain families seemed to suffer more losses than others during the war, about why some people received Dumbledore's personal attention and then didn't survive to benefit from it." Harry felt a familiar chill. What has she found? Records, letters, ministry documents that my grandmother's position gives her access to. Neville's voice grew stronger as he continued. "That she says there's a pattern of young people, brilliant, powerful, morally upright young people, who died just before they would have gained the influence to challenge certain established authorities." "Like my parents," Harry said quietly. "Like a lot of people's parents," Neville replied. "My grandmother thinks She thinks that some of the war casualties weren't really casualties of war. They were casualties of peace. People who might have questioned the methods used to achieve victory. A new voice spoke from across the circle, startling everyone. Daphne Greengrass sat perfectly poised in her chair, her Slytherin composure intact, despite the revolutionary nature of the conversation she was participating in. "My family has been discussing these matters as well," she said, in her carefully modulated voice. "Not openly, you understand, but in the kind of quiet conversations that happen when people realize they may have been misled about certain things." Harry stared at her. Daphne Greengrass was perhaps the most unlikely revolutionary he could have imagined. Pure blood, wealthy, connected to all the traditional power structures of wizarding society. "Why are you here?" he asked directly. "Because I've been watching what happened to Draco," she said simply. "And to Crabbe and Goyle, and to half the Slytherin house, really. We've been taught that our worth comes from our family names, our blood status, our willingness to follow certain expectations about how pure bloods should behave. But those expectations always seem to serve the same people, don't they? Meaning that every generation, the most promising Slytherins either die young in service to some cause or live long lives as functionaries serving others' agendas." Daphne's carefully neutral expression cracked slightly, revealing genuine anger underneath. "My older sister was brilliant, Harry, absolutely brilliant. She could have changed the wizarding world. Instead, she died at 19 in a training accident while learning advanced magic from a private tutor that Dumbledore personally recommended." The circle fell silent. Harry had never heard about Daphne's sister, had never even known she existed, but the pattern was becoming so familiar that he felt sick just hearing about another young life cut short under suspicious circumstances. "How many of us are there?" Hermione asked quietly. "How many students have lost family members or friends to these all convenient accidents?" The answers came slowly, hesitantly, as if speaking the words aloud made them more real and therefore more dangerous. Susan Bones mentioned a cousin who died while conducting ministry research into wartime intelligence failures. Terry Boot spoke of an older brother whose questions about certain professors' wartime activities had led to his mysterious disappearance during a study abroad program. Even quiet Hannah Abbott revealed that her aunt had been asking uncomfortable questions about Dumbledore's methods when she suffered a sudden, inexplicable magical accident. "It's not just individual cases," Luna said dreamily. "It's a system. A way of ensuring that anyone who might challenge established authority either dies, disappears, or becomes too frightened to speak up. Which brings us to the question," Blaise said, his voice cutting through the increasingly heavy atmosphere, "of what we intend to do about it." The question hung in the air like a challenge. They had all come together because they recognized the pattern, but recognition alone wouldn't protect future victims or bring justice for past ones. "We document everything," Hermione said immediately. "Every suspicious death, every convenient accident, every family that suffered losses after asking questions. We build a case so comprehensive that it can't be dismissed or suppressed." "We protect each other," Neville added firmly. "No one faces pressure or threats alone. We make sure that anyone who joins us has support, backup, are people who will notice if something happens to them. We spread the word carefully," Susan Bones contributed. "My Aunt Amelia is already investigating some of these matters through official channels. If we can provide her with additional evidence, additional witnesses." "We plan for the long term," Daphne said quietly. "Most of us will be leaving Hogwarts soon. We need to think about how this movement continues beyond school, how we protect ourselves and each other as adults." Harry listened to his unlikely allies planning and strategizing, feeling something he hadn't experienced since childhood, hope for a future he actually wanted to live in. These weren't adults manipulating him toward predetermined conclusions. These were peers, equals, people choosing to stand up for what was right because it was right. but not because they'd been guided toward that choice. "There's something else we need to consider," he said, when the immediate planning had concluded. "Dumbledore won't ignore what's happening here. He can't afford to let a student resistance movement grow unchecked. He'll try to stop us." "Let him try," Terry said with unexpected fierceness. "We're not first years anymore. We're not helpless children who have to accept whatever adults decide is best for us." "And we're not alone," Luna added, her voice carrying an odd certainty. "There are others, adults who have been asking the same questions we're asking. People in the ministry, in other schools, in other countries. The pattern isn't limited to Britain, and neither is the resistance." Harry looked around the circle at faces that reflected determination, anger, hope, and fear in equal measure. A month ago, he had been one boy questioning one adult's authority. Now he was part of a movement that might actually have the power to challenge the system that had shaped their world. "What are you thinking?" Hermione asked, clearly recognizing his expression. "I'm thinking about choice," Harry said slowly. "About how many people have been denied the chance to choose their own paths because someone else decided their choices for them. About how many brilliant, powerful, morally upright young people might still be alive if they'd had allies, support, people willing to stand with them against authority." He stood, looking at each person in the circle. "I'm thinking that maybe we can be those allies for each other. Maybe we can build something better than what we inherited. Maybe we can make sure that the next generation doesn't have to grow up in a world where questioning authority is a death sentence." "That's a dangerous thing to hope for," Daphne said quietly. "Good," Harry replied. "The best hopes usually are." As the meeting wound down and students began to slip away in small groups, Harry found himself standing by the fire with Hermione and Blaise, watching the flames dance in the hearth. "It's really happening, isn't it?" Hermione said softly. "We're really building something that could change everything." "We're building something that could get us all killed," Blaise corrected, but his tone was oddly satisfied. "Which makes it exactly the kind of project worth pursuing." Harry nodded, thinking about the future, not the future Dumbledore had scripted for him, but the one he and his allies were choosing to create. It would be dangerous. It would require sacrifice. It would probably cost them more than they could currently imagine. But for the first time in his life, Harry Potter was helping to build something, instead of just surviving what others had built for him. And that, he thought, as he watched his friends' faces in the firelight, made any risk worth taking. The revolution had begun with 3 students questioning authority in secret. Tonight, it had become something larger, a network of young people who refused to accept that their futures had already been decided for them. Tomorrow, they would find out what that refusal would cost. But whatever the price, they would pay it together, as equals, as allies, as friends who had chosen each other freely, rather than being manipulated into relationship by those who sought to control them. For the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, Harry was truly excited about what might come next. Chapter 12. Breaking Free. The summons came at dawn, delivered not by Owl but by Professor McGonagall herself, her face grave and her eyes avoiding Harry's as she handed him the parchment. The message was brief. "My office. Immediately. We must discuss your future." It was signed simply, a PWBD, in Dumbledore's familiar spidery script. Harry folded the parchment carefully, knowing this moment had been inevitable since their network had begun to spread beyond the original circle. Word of their resistance had reached the wrong ears, or perhaps the right ones, depending on perspective. Either way, as the time for subtle maneuvering had ended. "Harry," Hermione said quietly from her bed across the dormitory, where she had been pretending to sleep. "Are you ready for this?" "As ready as I can be," Harry replied, checking that the small bag he'd packed 3 days ago was still hidden under his bed. They had all known this moment was coming, had planned for it, prepared for it, dreaded it, and welcomed it in equal measure. The walk to Dumbledore's office felt like a funeral march, though Harry couldn't say whether it was for his childhood innocence, his faith in authority, or something else entirely. The gargoyle stepped aside without requiring a password, as if it too understood that this meeting transcended normal protocols. Dumbledore sat behind his desk exactly as he always did, but something fundamental had changed in his posture. The grandfatherly facade was gone, replaced by something harder and more desperate. His blue eyes, when they met Harry's, carried the weight of a man who had spent decades building something that was now crumbling around him. "Harry," Dumbledore said, and his voice carried none of its usual warmth. "Please sit. We have reached a crossroads that I had hoped to avoid." Harry remained standing. "Have we, Professor? Or have we simply reached the point where you can no longer pretend that your guidance serves anyone's interests but your own? You have been listening to dangerous counsel, my boy. Individuals who seek to undermine the very foundations of our society for reasons you may not fully understand." Dumbledore's fingers steepled, then separated, then steepled again, a nervous gesture Harry had never seen from him before. "The network you have built, the questions you have been raising, the resistance you have fostered, it threatens to undo decades of carefully maintained stability. Stability built on lies and manipulation," Harry said firmly. "Stability that requires the sacrifice of innocent people to maintain itself. Stability that has kept our world from falling into chaos and darkness," Dumbledore countered, rising from his chair. "Harry, you cannot possibly understand the weight of responsibility that comes with making decisions that affect thousands of lives. The choices I have made, the guidance I have provided, the sacrifices that have been required, all of it has served a greater purpose." "Your greater purpose," Harry said. "Not theirs, not mine, yours. The distinction is meaningless when the alternative is the collapse of everything we have built together." Dumbledore moved around his desk, approaching Harry with the careful steps of someone trying not to spook a dangerous animal. "The prophecy." "What prophecy?" Harry interrupted sharply. Dumbledore stopped, seeming to realize he had revealed more than he intended. "There are certain predictions about your role in the future of our world, predictions that require careful preparation, specific experiences, particular kinds of strength that can only be forged through trauma," Harry finished. "Through isolation, manipulation, and engineered suffering. Through turning a child into a weapon designed to serve your vision of how the world should be shaped. Through preparing you for challenges that will come whether we wish them to or not," Dumbledore said desperately. "Harry, Voldemort will return. When he does, you will be the only one with the power to stop him. Everything I have done, every choice I have made, has been to ensure that you will be ready for that moment." Harry stared at the man who had defined his entire existence, feeling something that might have been pity. "And what if I choose not to be your weapon, Professor? What if I decide that your prophecy, whatever it says, doesn't get to determine how I live my life?" "Then everyone you care about will die," Dumbledore said simply, and for the first time his mask slipped completely. "Your friends, your allies, and everyone in your resistance network, everyone in the wizarding world, they will all perish because you chose personal freedom over collective survival." The threat was delivered with the same gentle tone Dumbledore used for offering tea and biscuits, which somehow made it more chilling than if he had shouted it. "And if I do become your weapon?" Harry asked. "What happens to them then?" "They will be protected, guided, given roles that serve the greater good while keeping them safe from the worst consequences of the war that is coming. Like my parents were protected." Dumbledore's face went pale, but he didn't flinch from the accusation. "Your parents made their choice. They chose to fight, knowing the risks. I provided guidance, but ultimately, they decided their own fate. You manipulated them into choosing death," Harry said flatly, just like you're trying to manipulate me into choosing to become your personal executioner. I am trying to save our world, Dumbledore said, and for a moment his voice cracked with genuine emotion. Harry, you cannot imagine the burden of knowing what's coming, of seeing the threads of fate and prophecy weaving together toward inevitable catastrophe. Everything I have done has been to prevent that catastrophe, even when it required difficult choices. Difficult for who? Harry demanded. For the people you sacrifice? Or for you when you have to live with the consequences? Before Dumbledore could answer, the office door opened, and Blaise stepped inside, followed immediately by Hermione, both moved with the purposeful calm of people who had planned this moment carefully. "Ah," Dumbledore said, his composure returning as he faced the three of them together. "The full conspiracy reveals itself. Mr. Zabini, Miss Granger, I trust you have come to encourage Harry to see reason." "We've come to offer him alternatives," Blaise said smoothly, producing a set of official-looking documents from his robes. "Portkey authorizations for educational exchange programs, letters of recommendation from the Bulgarian Minister of Magic, sanctuary agreements that will place him beyond the reach of both the British Ministry and other interested parties." Dumbledore's eyes sharpened dangerously. "You would steal him away to foreign lands where he cannot fulfill his destiny." "We would give him the choice to determine his own destiny," Hermione corrected. "The choice you've spent 13 years making sure he never had." "And you, Miss Granger?" Dumbledore turned his piercing gaze on her. "Are you prepared to abandon your education, your future, your family's expectations, to follow this dangerous path?" "I'm prepared to follow my conscience, rather than authority figures who claim to know what's best for me while manipulating me toward predetermined conclusions," Hermione replied steadily. "My parents raised me to think for myself, Professor. They'll understand, even if it takes time." "And your families will forgive you when their choices lead to the destruction of everything you claim to protect?" Dumbledore's voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. "When Voldemort returns and finds Harry Potter hidden away in some foreign sanctuary, unprepared for the battle that only he can fight?" "Maybe," Harry said quietly. "Voldemort will find something he's not prepared for either." "What do you mean?" "I mean, maybe a boy who was raised with love instead of manipulation, who learned to think for himself instead of following orders, who built genuine alliances instead of being isolated and controlled. Maybe that boy would be better equipped to face a dark wizard than the broken weapon you've been trying to create." Harry moved toward the door, his decision crystallizing with each word. "I choose freedom, Professor. I choose the risk of failure over the certainty of being used. I choose my friends over your destiny. And I choose to find out what I'm capable of when I'm not being manipulated by someone who thinks my life belongs to him." "Harry, please!" Dumbledore's voice broke as he spoke. "You don't understand what you're risking. The prophecy can go hang itself," Harry said firmly, placing his hand on the door handle. "I don't care what your prophecy says about me, Professor. I care about what I say about myself. And what I say is that Harry Potter is done being your chess piece." He opened the door and stepped into the corridor, followed immediately by Hermione and Blaise. Behind them, Dumbledore called out one last desperate appeal. "If you leave now, if you abandon your training, your preparation, your destiny, then when the darkness comes, it will be on your head. Every death, every tragedy, every moment of suffering that could have been prevented, it will all be your responsibility." Harry paused in the doorway, looking back at the man who had shaped his entire life through careful manipulation and engineered trauma. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm certainty of someone who had finally learned the difference between responsibility and manipulation. "Professor," he said quietly, "I've spent 13 years taking responsibility for tragedies that other people caused. I've spent 13 years believing that my worth was measured by my willingness to suffer for others. But my friends have taught me something different, that I'm valuable just as I am, and that real love means protecting each other, or not using each other. He smiled, and for the first time in months, it was completely genuine. If the darkness comes, we'll face it together, as equals, as friends who chose each other freely. And maybe that will be enough. Maybe it will be better than anything your manipulation could have produced. The corridor beyond Dumbledore's office stretched before them like a promise. Their bags were packed, their plans were made, their sanctuary was waiting. The portkey would activate in 20 minutes, carrying them away from Hogwarts, away from Britain, away from everything they had been taught to believe about their roles in the world. "Are you scared?" Hermione asked, as they walked toward the exit. "Terrified," Harry admitted, "but it's a different kind of fear. It's the fear of someone who gets to choose their own risks instead of having them chosen for them." "The best kind of fear," Blaise observed, checking his pocket watch. "The kind that means you're finally living your own life." As they reached the entrance hall, Harry paused to look back at Hogwarts, the ancient castle that had been both prison and sanctuary, the place where he had learned magic and friendship, and the bitter truth about adult authority. "Do you think we'll be back?" he asked. "Someday," Hermione said confidently. "When we're strong enough to return on our own terms. When we've built something worth protecting that doesn't require the sacrifice of innocent people to maintain. When we've proven that there are better ways to fight darkness than by creating broken weapons," Blaise added. Harry nodded, not feeling the weight of the future settling on his shoulders, not as a burden imposed by others, but as a responsibility he was choosing to accept. For the first time in his life, he was walking toward an unknown future, not because adults had guided him there, but because he and his friends had chosen it together. The portkey glowed softly in Blaise's hand, activated by the approach of the appointed time. Harry took Hermione's hand with his right, Blaise's with his left, and felt the familiar tug of magical transportation. As Hogwarts disappeared around them, Harry Potter closed his eyes and opened them on the first day of a life that was truly his own. Behind them, in his tower office, Albus Dumbledore sat alone among his instruments and artifacts, contemplating the ruins of plans laid for decades, and wondering if, perhaps, he had finally pushed his most valuable piece too far. The revolution had begun with 3 students questioning authority. It ended with them walking away from it entirely, choosing the uncertain promise of freedom over the comfortable chains of manipulation. And in that choice, they found something that no prophecy could have predicted, and no manipulation could have produced. The strength that comes from being loved for who you are, rather than used for who you might become. It would have to be enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Yet what if Petunia Dursley left, Harry on the Weasleys' doorstep? At age 3, and Molly raised him as her 8th child. What if the Sorting Hat refused to sort Harry until Dumbledore answered for what he had done to the boy? What if Hermione used a time-turner to go back to the night Harry's parents died and found Dumbledore already there, watching what if Minerva McGonagall quit Hogwarts at age 60 and raised Harry in a cottage in Scotland, far from Dumbledore's control? What if Sirius Black and Fleur Delacour arrived at the Dursleys on the same night, both determined to take Harry and never bring him back? What if Cedric Diggory survived the graveyard and testified that Dumbledore knew the tournament was a trap? What if Bill Weasley broke every ward Dumbledore had placed on Privet Drive and found dark magic that should never have been nearer? To child what if Hermione found a locked room in Hogwarts that contained every child Dumbledore had sacrificed before? Harry what if Severus Snape took Harry the night Lily died and raised him in Spinner's End without telling a soul? What if Victor Krum offered Harry asylum in Bulgaria after the Triwizard Tournament and Hermione helped him escape? What if Harry walked out of Hogwarts in front of the entire school At age 12, and Snape was the one who held the door open, what if Pansy Parkinson overheard Dumbledore's plan in the dungeons and warned Harry before it was too late? What if Lily Potter left a second letter hidden in Gringotts, and it named every person Dumbledore told her to trust? What if Amelia Bones launched a full investigation into Dumbledore after Harry's name came out of the Goblet of Fire? What if the Hogwarts portraits came tried alive during Harry's trial and every former headmaster testified against Dumbledore? What if Neville Longbottom's grandmother Augusta demanded Harry be placed with her after she learned what the Dursleys had done? What if Draco Malfoy switched sides at age 13, after watching Dumbledore send Harry into the Chamber of Secrets alone? What if Arthur Weasley found Dumbledore's name on a ministry surveillance order for Harry, filed the day after Lily and James died? What if the Goblin Nation declared Harry a protected ward of Gringotts and told Dumbledore he had no authority over the Potter vaults? What if Kingsley Shacklebolt found Harry during a routine or a check on Privet Drive and reported the Dursleys to the Ministry? What if Remus Lupin found Lily's diary in the ruins of Godric's Hollow, and every entry was about Dumbledore's demands? What if Madame Pomfrey documented every injury Harry arrived with each September and handed the file to the Wizengamot? What if Blaise Zabini and Hermione Granger formed a secret alliance in third year to get Harry out of Dumbledore's grip? What if Neville Longbottom was the boy who lived instead, and Harry grew up free until Dumbledore came looking for him at age 14? What if every Hogwarts student in Harry's year signed a petition against Dumbledore, and Luna Lovegood delivered it to the Daily Prophet? What if Fleur Delacour brought the French ministry's auras to Hogwarts after the third task, and demanded Harry be released into her custody? What if Dobby smuggled Harry out of Privet Drive at age 6 and hid him in the room of requirement for 5 years? Before Hogwarts, what if Winky the House Elf testified at the Wizengamot that Barty Crouch, Sr., knew about Dumbledore's plan for Harry all along?